In September 1941, Leningrad, the proud industrial and cultural heart of the Soviet Union, found itself encircled by German and Finnish forces in a strategic move that would mark the beginning of one of the most grueling sieges in human history. The city, with its rich history, thriving industries, and dense population, became a focal point in Hitler's plan to crush Soviet resistance and secure a decisive victory on the Eastern Front. For the residents and defenders of Leningrad, the encirclement was the first chilling indication that survival would depend on endurance, ingenuity, and sheer will. The German army, under the command of Army Group North, and Finnish forces from the north, executed a precise blockade, cutting off all land routes into the city. Railways, roads, and supply lines were severed, leaving Leningrad increasingly isolated from the rest of the Soviet Union. While Soviet planners had anticipated attacks on major cities, few could comprehend the scale and duration of what was to come. German artillery and air units began bombardments almost immediately, testing the city's defenses and signaling the beginning of a prolonged siege. In the streets of Leningrad, civilians quickly realized the severity of the situation. Rumors of encirclement spread rapidly, and panic mingled with determination. Residents began to stockpile essential supplies, while municipal authorities organized food distribution and civil defense measures. Factories that produced weapons, ammunition, and essential goods transitioned to wartime production, even as workers faced the constant threat of bombing. Families huddled in basements, schools were converted into shelters, and hospitals braced for an influx of casualties. The sense of impending catastrophe pervaded every corner of the city. Soviet military units stationed within Leningrad moved swiftly to fortify the city's defenses. Trenches were dug, anti-tank obstacles erected, and artillery positions established along the outskirts of the encircled perimeter. Soldiers, both regular troops and hastily conscripted citizens, drilled tirelessly, preparing for the first wave of attacks. Coordination between military planners and civil authorities became a lifeline. Every building, every street corner, and every bridge had to be secured and repurposed to withstand the coming assaults. The initial bombardments were relentless yet measured, designed to test the city's defenses and sow fear among its residents. Explosions rocked neighborhoods, sending plumes of smoke and dust into the sky, while the distant rumble of artillery reminded civilians of the city's precarious position. Windows shattered, roofs crumbled, and families were forced to evacuate homes into communal shelters. Yet amidst the chaos, a remarkable spirit of resilience began to take hold. Community kitchens were set up, volunteers organized fire brigades, and citizens joined in reinforcing barricades and digging trenches, demonstrating that the defense of Leningrad was not only a military task but a communal effort. The psychological impact of the encirclement was profound. Residents faced the knowledge that supplies from the outside would be cut off, and that the siege could last for months, perhaps years. The Soviet government communicated through radio broadcasts and newspapers, urging calm and resilience, stressing the importance of unity and vigilance. Propaganda emphasized Leningrad's symbolic importance to the Soviet Union, portraying the city as a fortress whose endurance would demonstrate the strength of the entire nation. Military strategists within the city worked feverishly to anticipate German tactics. Defensive positions were reinforced, and contingency plans were developed for both offensive and defensive actions. Snipers were placed in strategic locations, and engineers rigged buildings with explosives as fallback positions. The coordination of artillery, infantry, and militia forces aimed to create overlapping fields of fire and multiple layers of resistance, ensuring that any German incursion would be met with maximized resistance. Meanwhile, civilians took measures to protect their families and neighbors. Schools, theaters, and public buildings were converted into shelters, while underground stations and tunnels offered refuge from bombardment. Citizens contributed to the war effort by manufacturing clothing, ammunition, and supplies, despite growing shortages and the threat of continuous air raids. The city's newspapers reported on the ongoing preparations, emphasizing both the need for vigilance and the shared responsibility of survival. Despite the looming crisis, Leningrad's cultural and social life did not completely cease. Artists, musicians, and writers sought to maintain morale, performing in shelters and small theaters, writing poetry, and documenting the unfolding crisis. This cultural resilience became a critical tool in sustaining the psychological endurance of the population, offering hope amidst the uncertainty and fear. As September 1941 progressed, the German and Finnish encirclement tightened. Observation posts reported movements along the city's perimeter, while reconnaissance flights monitored any Soviet attempt to break the blockade. For Leningrad, the calm before the storm was a time of preparation, adaptation, and the forging of extraordinary resilience. Soldiers drilled and civilians organized, all acutely aware that the true test had only just begun. In retrospect, the beginning of the siege represented a pivotal moment in the Eastern Front. Leningrad's encirclement would set the stage for a 900-day ordeal, one defined not by conventional maneuvers alone but by the interplay of starvation, extreme weather, disease, and relentless bombardment. The city's response, a combination of military ingenuity, civilian solidarity, and unyielding determination, would become emblematic of human endurance under impossible circumstances. By the end of the first month, it was clear that Leningrad would not succumb easily. The residents had begun to adapt to shortages, the military had fortified key positions, and a spirit of collective resistance had taken hold. Every barricade reinforced, every trench dug, and every ration carefully measured was a testament to the city's determination to survive. The siege's opening phase was a study in contrasts, German and Finnish forces methodically tightening the noose, while Leningrad's citizens and defenders responded with ingenuity, courage, and sheer perseverance. It was the calm before a storm that would last nearly 3 years, during which the city would face unimaginable hardship, witness heroic feats, and endure suffering beyond measure. In these early days, the encirclement's full horror was only beginning to unfold, yet Leningrad had already demonstrated the qualities that would define its survival: organization, unity, and an indomitable spirit. Soldiers and civilians alike braced for the unprecedented siege, preparing to withstand bombardments, starvation, and isolation. The city was encircled, but not defeated. Its heart, culture, and resolve would sustain it through the darkest days ahead. The siege of Leningrad had begun, and the world was about to witness one of the most extraordinary examples of human endurance in the history of warfare. The city, surrounded on all sides, faced the encroaching threat with a combination of military strategy, civilian cooperation, and sheer willpower that would allow it to endure 900 days of hunger, ice, and death. From the very first day of encirclement, Leningrad's story became one of resilience against impossible odds, a testament to the human spirit that would echo for generations to come. As the encirclement of Leningrad tightened in the early days of the siege, the city's inhabitants realized that survival would require immediate, coordinated action. Civilians and military personnel alike sprang into motion, determined to fortify not just the physical structures of the city, but the very spirit of its population against the oncoming storm of hunger, bombardment, and isolation. The first and most visible measure of preparation was the construction of civil defenses. Residents and soldiers worked side by side to pile sandbags along streets, in front of important buildings, and around factories and warehouses. Barricades were erected at key intersections and along bridges, creating choke points to slow any potential German advance should enemy forces breach the outer perimeter. Streets were cleared of debris that might hinder evacuation or impede emergency vehicles, while tunnels, basements, and subway stations were reinforced as shelters against artillery and aerial bombardment. Evacuation plans were drawn, prioritizing women, children, and the elderly for relocation to safer zones, though the scale of the blockade meant that full escape for all was impossible. In parallel, Leningrad's industrial complex shifted gears to meet wartime needs. Factories that had produced consumer goods were rapidly converted to produce ammunition, weapons, and essential wartime materials. Workers, including women and teenagers, labored under tremendous pressure, often with minimal food and heating, to keep production lines running. Repair shops and workshops focused on maintaining vehicles, artillery, and other essential equipment. Every hammer strike, every bolt tightened, and every assembly completed was a small but vital contribution to the city's defense. The industrial mobilization not only ensured a continuous supply of material but also reinforced the population's sense of purpose and unity. Beyond physical preparation, Leningrad's authorities recognized the importance of psychological resilience. Posters and radio broadcasts urged calm, patience, and solidarity, framing the blockade as a test of endurance and a defense of the Soviet homeland. Citizens were reminded of their shared history, cultural pride, and the heroism of those who had defended the city in past conflicts. Schools adapted curricula to emphasize patriotism, discipline, and practical skills, while community groups organized drills, rationing instruction, and first aid training. The goal was to instill a determined resolve amid the looming despair, to prepare the civilian population for months of hardship, deprivation, and uncertainty. Rationing measures were introduced preemptively, aiming to stretch dwindling food supplies while maintaining the health of the city's population as much as possible. Municipal authorities mapped out priority allocations, ensuring that key workers, such as medical staff, factory laborers, and civil defense volunteers, received sufficient sustenance to perform their duties. Alternative food sources were identified, from preserved grains and animal feed to foraged plants, and communal kitchens were established to maximize efficiency and reduce waste. Civilians also took individual initiative. Neighborhood committees formed to coordinate food distribution, provide medical assistance, and protect vulnerable families. Volunteers patrolled streets to prevent looting and maintain order, while informal networks ensured that elderly and infirm residents received care. The city became a collective organism, where survival depended on cooperation, vigilance, and the willingness of each individual to contribute to the greater good. Meanwhile, military planners worked to integrate the city's defenses with the natural geography. Artillery positions were strategically placed along rivers, rail lines, and major roads, while checkpoints and observation posts were established to monitor enemy movements. Snipers and machine gun nests were set up in rooftops and fortified buildings, ready to repel any attempted incursions. Engineers reinforced bridges and transportation hubs, ensuring that evacuation routes remained usable and that supply deliveries could continue, however limited they might be. The combination of civil preparation, industrial mobilization, and psychological readiness created a formidable network of resilience. Though supplies would inevitably dwindle and the hardships of the siege would soon become apparent, these early measures ensured that Leningrad was not caught unprepared. The city's population understood that their survival would depend on endurance, resourcefulness, and unwavering determination. By the end of the initial preparation period, the city presented a dual image, outwardly scarred with fortifications, barricades, and construction, yet inwardly strengthened with a collective determination to endure. Families, workers, and soldiers had begun to internalize the reality of the siege, understanding that courage and cooperation would be as crucial as artillery and barricades. Leningrad's preparations in September and October 1941 would prove essential in the months to come. The fortifications delayed enemy advances, the factories ensured a continued flow of munitions, and the psychological measures helped sustain morale as starvation, cold, and disease took their inevitable toll. The city had transformed itself into a fortress, not only of concrete and steel but of human will, demonstrating that survival in the face of overwhelming adversity was as much a mental and social effort as a physical one. The early days of preparation established patterns that would endure throughout the 900-day siege. Civilians learned to ration, conserve, and support one another. Soldiers and volunteers took shifts in defense and infrastructure maintenance. The city's leaders coordinated logistics, communications, and morale-boosting efforts. These measures would become the backbone of Leningrad's resistance, allowing it to withstand what many had predicted would be a swift and devastating collapse. In essence, the city's fortification efforts, both literal and figurative, exemplified collective endurance in the face of unprecedented adversity. Leningrad prepared not only for the bombs and bullets of an enemy outside its walls but for the slow, grinding pressures of hunger, cold, and isolation that would define the siege. By taking these early steps, the city transformed fear into action, chaos into order, and despair into determined resolve, setting the stage for an extraordinary story of survival that would resonate through history. As autumn turned into winter in 1941, Leningrad found itself grappling with a reality far harsher than the threat posed by German and Finnish forces alone. The encirclement had already begun to strain the city's resources, but the arrival of winter introduced a relentless and unyielding enemy, the bitter cold of the Russian winter. Snow-blanketed streets and rooftops, rivers began to freeze, and temperatures dropped well below zero, creating conditions that would claim countless lives alongside the bullets and bombs of the ongoing siege. Heating became an immediate and critical concern. The city's coal and fuel reserves were limited, and with supply lines severed by the encirclement, households, factories, and hospitals faced freezing temperatures inside poorly insulated buildings. Stoves and furnaces were rationed, and families huddled together in tiny rooms, sharing warmth where they could. Many improvised with wood, scrap metal, and anything combustible to maintain even a flicker of heat, often at the cost of fire hazards or exhaustion. Food scarcity compounded the city's suffering. Already rationed to minimal amounts, provisions dwindled further as the cold made transport and delivery increasingly difficult. Roads and rail lines were blocked by snow and ice, and the risk of German artillery and air raids further slowed what little supply movement was possible. Citizens subsisted on a diet of black bread, root vegetables, and improvised substitutes, with many facing extreme caloric deficits that left them weak and vulnerable to illness. Malnutrition became widespread, making the population more susceptible to frostbite, pneumonia, and influenza. Frostbite became a grim, ubiquitous threat. Without adequate heating or protective clothing, fingers, toes, ears, and noses were exposed to sub-zero temperatures during daily work or foraging for firewood and food. Early frostbite cases quickly escalated to gangrene in some instances, leading to amputations or death. Civilians, factory workers, and soldiers alike experienced the slow, painful effects of cold that pierced even through multiple layers of clothing. The struggle against frost became a daily reality, as survival often depended on maintaining body heat through constant movement, shared body warmth, or limited stoves. The city's infrastructure, already stressed by bombardment, proved vulnerable to the harsh weather. Water pipes froze, cutting off access to essential clean water, while poorly insulated hospitals struggled to keep the wounded alive. Fires set for cooking or heating frequently caused accidental destruction, as snow and ice created slippery, unstable surfaces. Roads became treacherous, hampering ambulance transport, deliveries, and movement of personnel between critical sites. Even the simple act of walking outside became an endurance test, as icy winds cut through layers of clothing, and snow drifts slowed every journey. The psychological effects of the early winter were as severe as the physical challenges. Citizens confronted the stark reality that nature itself had become an adversary, indifferent to their suffering yet relentless in its cruelty. The cold amplified hunger, fatigue, and despair, while simultaneously reinforcing the need for communal support and solidarity. Families gathered tightly in homes, neighbors shared firewood and food, and communities pooled resources to maintain morale and stave off despair. Medical personnel faced almost insurmountable challenges. Doctors, nurses, and volunteers worked around the clock, often without proper heating, supplies, or nutrition themselves. Frostbite cases, hypothermia, and respiratory illnesses surged, overwhelming makeshift clinics. Corpses began accumulating as early deaths rose, a stark reminder of the stakes of both exposure and malnutrition. The simultaneous pressures of warfare in winter created a perfect storm, where each day was a battle not only against enemy action but against survival itself. Despite these extreme conditions, the city's resolve did not falter. Civil defense units reinforced shelters, factories continued producing essential materials for the war effort, and Soviet military units remained on high alert to repel incursions. Children, the elderly, and those unable to perform manual labor received assistance wherever possible, though resources were limited. Every ration, every bundle of firewood, and every warm blanket became a small act of resilience and defiance against the twin threats of enemy forces and the unforgiving winter. In the streets, makeshift stoves burned in courtyards, casting flickering light on snow-covered walls. People lined up patiently for meager food distributions, sharing news of the dead and injured. The once bustling city had become a landscape of endurance, where survival depended on careful planning, communal effort, and sheer willpower. The cold heightened both the hardships and the sense of shared struggle, binding citizens together in ways that no ordinary peace could have required. The early winter also underscored the importance of ingenuity. Citizens scavenged frozen canals for fish, collected tree bark and roots for improvised nutrition, and reused clothing and blankets to stave off frostbite. Factories heated spaces with stoves and improvised heaters, while medics devised creative treatments for hypothermia and cold-related injuries. Even small victories, maintaining a heated room, finding enough firewood, or keeping a child warm, were monumental in the harsh conditions. By the end of the first months of winter, it was clear that Leningrad faced not only an enemy army but the unyielding cruelty of nature itself. The siege had intensified, the population was stretched to the brink of endurance, and early deaths from cold and starvation began to mount. Yet, for all its harshness, the winter also revealed the resilience of the city's inhabitants, their ability to adapt, support one another, and persist despite unimaginable adversity. The onset of winter in Leningrad was not simply a season, it was an unrelenting adversary, testing physical endurance, mental fortitude, and communal cohesion. The early frostbite cases, dwindling fuel, and collapsing rations were a prelude to what would become a nearly 900-day struggle for survival. Citizens and soldiers alike would learn to endure hunger, ice, and relentless bombardment, forging a spirit that would define Leningrad through its darkest hours. From the first snowfall to the freezing nights spent in poorly insulated shelters, Leningrad's early winter set the tone for the hardships to come. It was a stark, unforgiving reminder that survival in the siege would require constant vigilance, resourcefulness, and the unwavering determination of a people united against both the enemy outside and the merciless cold that gripped the city from within. As Leningrad's winter deepened and the encirclement tightened, the city's food supply became critically scarce, marking the beginning of a period of extreme rationing and hunger that would define daily life for nearly 3 years. By late 1941, the city's pre-existing stockpiles of food were rapidly dwindling, and with all overland supply routes cut by German and Finnish forces, authorities faced the daunting task of stretching resources to sustain a population of over 2 million. The government quickly implemented strict rationing measures. Bread became the primary staple, and its portions were drastically reduced as supplies ran low. In some instances, rations were reduced to only 125 grams per person per day, barely enough to sustain life. Factory workers, soldiers, and essential service personnel received slightly higher allocations to maintain critical infrastructure and defense operations. Families were forced to prioritize the young, elderly, and infirm, often leaving adults to survive on meager scraps. With official rations insufficient, citizens turned to black markets and scavenging to supplement their meager food supply. Hidden markets sprang up in basements, back alleys, and abandoned buildings, trading anything from potatoes and grains to scraps of dried fish or edible plants. Prices skyrocketed, and many residents could not afford even these substitutes. Foraging became essential. Residents collected tree bark, roots, and even weeds to stave off starvation. In desperate cases, domestic animals were slaughtered, and in extreme circumstances, even inedible materials were boiled or baked into bread substitutes. Daily life became an endless struggle to obtain calories, with every meal rationed, calculated, and stretched as far as possible. Families spent hours queuing for bread and other rations, often in freezing temperatures, only to return home with insufficient supplies. Those unable to stand in line or scavenge were at extreme risk of starvation. Hunger became the constant backdrop to every action. Children scavenged for scraps in streets and garbage, mothers rationed the last bits of flour or sugar, and workers carried on their duties despite growing weakness. The effects of prolonged starvation were immediate and profound. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making civilians more susceptible to disease, frostbite, and infections. Fatigue and dizziness became daily companions, and the city saw early deaths not from bullets but from simple deprivation. Despite these harrowing conditions, the people of Leningrad demonstrated remarkable grit and ingenuity, devising ways to stretch resources, share food among neighbors, and sustain themselves through the winter months. Communities organized themselves around mutual aid, forming small networks to redistribute scarce resources. In some neighborhoods, residents pooled their rations, ensuring that no family was completely without food. Volunteers risked punishment to bring supplies to the most vulnerable, and improvised kitchens cooked meals for those unable to prepare them at home. These acts of solidarity were critical in maintaining morale and human dignity amid extreme adversity. Even in workplaces, resourcefulness became a survival tool. Factory cafeterias rationed meals, often mixing sawdust or other fillers into bread to extend portions. Soldiers and laborers used scraps from production facilities as supplemental nutrition. Every ounce of food was measured and allocated with precision, as waste was a luxury the city could no longer afford. The black market, while offering temporary relief, was also a source of danger. Prices were inflated, and punishments for hoarding or illicit trade were severe. Yet, it remained a lifeline for many, providing access to items otherwise unavailable. Hunger drove citizens to improvisation and risk, highlighting both the desperation and the grim determination that characterized life under siege. Children were particularly vulnerable. Schools attempted to provide small portions of porridge or bread, but the scarcity meant that many children went days with minimal nutrition. Malnutrition stunted growth and weakened the immune system, yet many adapted, learning to survive on the bare minimum. Parents faced agonizing decisions, often sacrificing their own portions to feed their children, a testament to the resilience and love that endured even in the face of unimaginable hardship. In the streets, the signs of hunger were unmistakable. Citizens scavenged frozen canals for fish, collected fallen grains from fields outside the city, or traded personal belongings for small amounts of food. The city itself became a constant negotiation between survival and despair, as every day required resourcefulness, endurance, and sometimes sheer luck. The psychological impact of hunger was profound. Citizens suffered not only physically but emotionally, as anxiety, despair, and fear of death became pervasive. Yet, amid this suffering, the human spirit persisted. Families maintained traditions where possible, Neighbors helped one another, and small acts of generosity preserved a sense of community and shared purpose. Survival became both an individual and collective endeavor. By the end of the first winter, the extreme rationing and hunger had already taken a measurable toll on the population. The city had adapted, but only just. Every day was a fight to stretch calories, maintain strength, and protect the vulnerable. Food became more than sustenance, it became the central axis around which life revolved, influencing social structures, work routines, and personal relationships. In retrospect, the rationing and hunger of Leningrad were more than logistical challenges, they were tests of endurance, ingenuity, and community. They highlighted the resilience of the human spirit in the face of sustained deprivation and foreshadowed the extraordinary feats of survival that would define the remainder of the 900-day siege. Every loaf of bread, every shared scrap, and every act of care became a statement of defiance against starvation and encirclement, ensuring that the city would endure despite the unrelenting pressure of war. The siege of Leningrad had reduced daily life to a struggle for survival, but in this struggle, the citizens of the city demonstrated that human determination could outlast both hunger and fear. The extreme rationing, black markets, and desperate measures were not signs of surrender but of ingenuity, resilience, and a community determined to withstand what many believed would be an unstoppable force. Leningrad survived, and through hunger, the city forged a spirit that would endure the harshest trials of war. By late 1941, Leningrad had entered a grim new phase of the siege. With the winter tightening its grip, the city's population began to feel the full weight of starvation, disease, and exposure, and the first wave of casualties claimed thousands of lives. The blockade imposed by German and Finnish forces cut off all land supply routes, leaving food, fuel, and medical supplies dangerously scarce. Bread rations had fallen to mere fractions of what was necessary for survival, and substitute foods, from sawdust-laced bread to boiled roots, barely sustained life. The cold compounded the suffering. Temperatures routinely fell well below freezing, and homes, apartments, and public buildings lacked adequate heating. Frostbite and hypothermia became common, striking the weakest first: children, the elderly, and the ill. Hospitals, already strained by the influx of casualties from early bombardments, were overwhelmed. Staff worked tirelessly, often without proper equipment or fuel for heating, struggling to care for patients debilitated by hunger, frostbite, and illness. Makeshift infirmaries were set up in basements, schools, and even subway stations, but the sheer volume of cases quickly outpaced the capacity of medical personnel. Disease spread with alarming speed. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, and crowded living conditions accelerated the transmission of typhus, dysentery, and respiratory infections. The city's infrastructure, crippled by bombardment and neglect, was unable to mitigate these epidemics. Corpses began accumulating in apartments, streets, and stairwells, as municipal authorities struggled to bury the dead under frozen, snowbound ground. The sight of bodies lying in public spaces was a daily reminder of the siege's unrelenting cruelty, instilling both terror and despair in those who survived. Morale began to waver. Families mourned multiple members, neighbors whispered of friends lost overnight, and children went hungry and weak. The psychological burden of seeing death around every corner tested the city's resilience. Rumors of starvation, disease, and impending surrender circulated constantly, threatening to break the community's resolve. Yet, despite the mounting casualties, Leningrad refused to surrender. Civilian authorities, military leaders, and ordinary residents alike clung to the belief that endurance, ingenuity, and unity could preserve the city until relief arrived. Efforts to cope with the rising death toll were desperate but ingenious. Community kitchens operated under extreme scarcity, distributing meager portions of bread and soup. Neighbors shared whatever they could spare, creating networks of mutual aid that, while insufficient to prevent deaths, provided critical support for survival. Volunteers collected the bodies of the dead and arranged hurried burials, often in improvised graves along frozen riverbanks or in mass plots. These acts, carried out amidst grief and fear, exemplified the city's determination to maintain humanity even in the face of relentless suffering. The first wave of casualties also had a profound social impact. Entire neighborhoods were depopulated as families succumbed to hunger or fled the worst affected areas. Orphaned children wandered the streets, scavenging for food and warmth. The loss of adults and skilled workers disrupted the city's industrial and logistical capacity, further compounding the challenges of sustaining defense efforts and essential services. Despite these devastating effects, Leningrad's defenders organized rotations for soldiers, prioritized vital industries, and improvised solutions to maintain minimal functionality. The relentless suffering created a paradoxical mixture of fear and resilience. Citizens confronted daily reminders of mortality, yet many adapted to extreme conditions, finding ways to survive, share, and maintain morale. Schools and cultural institutions attempted to continue operations in whatever form possible, providing children and families with routines, education, and distraction from the ever-present specter of death. Music, theater, and radio programs became tools for maintaining psychological endurance, reminding citizens that the city's culture and identity could endure even as bodies fell. By the end of the first few months of winter, it was evident that the siege would not only be fought with weapons but through sheer human endurance against starvation, cold, and disease. Every day witnessed casualties rising quietly, often unnoticed amid the chaos of survival. Yet the population of Leningrad adapted with grim determination, implementing rationing, scavenging, and resource-sharing systems that, while insufficient to prevent death, allowed the city to hold together under extraordinary pressure. In essence, the first wave of casualties was both a tragedy and a test. Starvation claimed bodies, frostbite crippled the living, and disease struck indiscriminately, but the city's spirit, bolstered by civic cooperation, military defense, and cultural resilience, endured. Leningrad became a city defined not by the absence of death but by the extraordinary measures its citizens took to preserve life and morale, setting the stage for an enduring story of human endurance and defiance that would span nearly 900 days. Despite the mounting death toll, the city's inhabitants understood that survival was an act of resistance. Every loaf of bread, every rescued child, every makeshift hospital was a testament to their determination. Even in sorrow and exhaustion, the population remained steadfast, proving that human resilience could persevere against both the horrors of war and the merciless Russian winter. Leningrad had entered a period of relentless suffering, yet its refusal to break marked the beginning of a long, tragic, and heroic chapter in history. As the siege of Leningrad dragged into its first winter months, the city's population faced a dire reality: food, fuel, and essential supplies were nearly gone, and the risk of mass starvation loomed over every street and apartment building. In this desperate hour, the Soviets relied on a remarkable feat of ingenuity and courage: the Road of Life, a supply and evacuation route across frozen Lake Ladoga, which would become a lifeline for the besieged city. The concept was deceptively simple. In winter, when the lake froze solid, trucks, sleds, and even horse-drawn wagons could traverse the ice to transport supplies from Soviet-held territory directly into Leningrad. Conversely, the route also allowed the evacuation of civilians, particularly the most vulnerable: children, the elderly, and the infirm, who otherwise faced near-certain death from hunger, cold, or disease. Yet the practical challenges were immense, and the operation was fraught with peril from both the elements and the enemy. The Germans quickly realized the importance of the route and sought to disrupt it with artillery fire, aerial bombing, and long-range artillery shells. Each journey across the ice became a tense gamble. Drivers and convoy commanders had to navigate treacherous cracks in the ice, deep snow drifts, and hidden obstacles, all while remaining alert to enemy reconnaissance and bombardment. Even a single mistake, a misjudged turn or a thin patch of ice, could plunge a vehicle, its cargo, and the people inside into the freezing waters below. Despite these dangers, heroic men and women kept the lifeline operational. Drivers pushed heavy trucks laden with food, coal, and medical supplies across the icy expanse, often working round-the-clock rotations to maximize the number of deliveries. Sailors and small boat operators ferried supplies during breaks in the freeze, carrying essential goods under enemy fire and in near-impossible conditions. Volunteers, including soldiers and civilians, guided convoys, repaired ice tracks, and rescued stranded travelers. Their courage was tireless, often bordering on self-sacrifice, as each trip risked death from enemy fire, freezing temperatures, or the ice giving way. The dangers were constant and immediate. German aircraft prowled the skies, dropping bombs and strafing the convoys with deadly precision. Artillery shells occasionally found their mark on the ice, shattering it and sending trucks plunging into the frigid water. Even without enemy action, the ice itself was treacherous, heavy snow concealed cracks, and blizzards reduced visibility to near zero, turning navigation into a life-or-death challenge. Drivers relied on markers, compasses, and sheer experience to guide their vehicles across the frozen expanse. Civilians who were evacuated often described the journey as surreal and terrifying. Families huddled together in trucks or sleds, their breath visible in the freezing air, the screams of ice cracking beneath them, and the ever-present fear of bombardment. Children clutched parents' hands tightly, sensing the danger even if they could not comprehend its full scale. For those who survived the crossings, the experience left a profound mark, a mixture of fear, gratitude, and enduring resilience. The road of life was also a symbol of hope and ingenuity. It demonstrated that even in the direst circumstances, human initiative could overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. Engineers devised plows to clear snow from the ice, reinforced vulnerable sections of the lake, and coordinated convoys with military precision. Every delivery of bread, flour, or coal was a tangible victory against the starvation threatening the city, while every evacuated civilian represented a life saved from the siege's deadly grip. As winter wore on, the operation became increasingly organized. Convoys followed strict schedules, often traveling in convoys escorted by armed vehicles to deter potential attacks. Communication was maintained with Leningrad through radio and signal flags, coordinating arrivals and departures to maximize safety and efficiency. Drivers and sailors developed techniques for handling frozen ice, including chains for tires, weighted loads for stability, and emergency procedures in case of cracking or artillery fire. The cumulative impact of the road of life cannot be overstated. Thousands of lives were preserved, and critical supplies reached hospitals, factories, and civil authorities, enabling Leningrad to endure months longer than its enemies expected. The ingenuity, courage, and endurance of the men and women who kept the lifeline open exemplified the human capacity to confront danger and adversity head-on, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The operation also had a profound psychological effect on the city's population. Knowing that help was arriving across the ice, even in limited quantities, bolstered morale and strengthened the collective determination to survive. Civilians worked tirelessly to distribute supplies, prepare shelters, and support one another, drawing strength from the knowledge that the road of life represented both a lifeline and a promise of continuity amidst unimaginable hardship. In essence, the road of life was a testament to resilience, coordination, and heroism. Every convoy that successfully crossed the frozen waters reaffirmed the city's determination to endure. Every rescued civilian and delivered sack of food represented defiance against the encircling forces and the merciless winter. The operation became a lifeline in both the literal and symbolic sense, embodying the city's unyielding spirit and collective ingenuity. By the end of the first winter, the road of life had proven that Leningrad could survive against both enemy siege and nature's harshest trials. It was a delicate, dangerous lifeline that required skill, courage, and cooperation at every level, from drivers navigating ice to civilians distributing rations. The route became an enduring symbol of the city's determination, a reminder that in the darkest times, human ingenuity and bravery could preserve life against overwhelming odds. The road of life carried more than bread and coal, it carried the hope of a city under siege, a tangible proof that Leningrad would not yield, and that courage and endurance could outlast even the most relentless forces of war and winter combined. Amid the relentless siege of Leningrad, the city's children became some of the most vulnerable and yet most resilient witnesses to the horrors of war. As the encirclement by German and Finnish forces tightened and winter deepened, food became increasingly scarce, hospitals overflowed, and the daily reality of death and disease became unavoidable. For the youngest residents, survival was no longer a matter of normal childhood routines but a test of endurance, ingenuity, and resilience against conditions far beyond their years. Starvation was a constant threat for children. Bread rations, already minimal, were often insufficient to sustain young bodies through the day. Families faced agonizing decisions about how to allocate meager portions, with parents sacrificing their own food to feed their children. In some cases, children were sent to relatives or safer quarters outside the city, but for many, evacuation was impossible due to the German blockade. Malnutrition set in quickly, leading to stunted growth, weakness, and susceptibility to disease. Small illnesses such as colds or fevers could escalate rapidly in children already weakened by hunger. Orphanhood was another tragic reality. Bombing raids, starvation, and disease claimed the lives of countless parents, leaving children to fend for themselves or rely on extended family members, neighbors, or the state's rudimentary support systems. Makeshift orphanages and shelters became critical havens, though they were often overcrowded and under-resourced. Children in these facilities faced the same hunger and cold as adults, but their youthful adaptability and communal spirit often helped them survive in ways that adults could not. Disease spread rapidly among the young, compounded by malnutrition and exposure. Typhus, dysentery, and respiratory infections were rampant, and medical care was limited due to shortages of staff, medicine, and fuel. Despite these obstacles, doctors, nurses, and volunteers worked tirelessly to treat the sick, often improvising with minimal equipment. Children who survived these early illnesses demonstrated a remarkable resilience and capacity for endurance, forming the backbone of the city's next generation. Education and social organization adapted to the siege's realities. Schools, where possible, operated in shifts, using available space and resources to maintain routines and provide structure for children. Lessons often included practical skills such as rationing, first aid, and fire safety, alongside reading, writing, and arithmetic. Communal kitchens and nurseries were organized to ensure that children received at least the smallest portions of nourishment and care. In these settings, children learned ingenuity and self-reliance, often helping each other gather firewood, prepare meals, or assist younger peers. Despite the overwhelming hardships, stories of resilience among children emerged. Some organized games or improvised play, transforming bombed-out buildings and snow-covered streets into spaces for imagination and distraction. Others displayed courage beyond their years, assisting families and neighbors with errands, firewood collection, and even medical tasks when adults were unable. These acts demonstrated a remarkable adaptability that allowed them to survive mentally and physically through circumstances that could have easily overwhelmed them. the psychological impact on children was profound. Exposure to constant bombardment, the death of family members, and the pervasive hunger created early trauma. Yet communal support, education, and shared responsibility provided small anchors of stability. Children often relied on each other for comfort, storytelling, and reassurance, forging bonds that not only helped them endure but also contributed to the social cohesion of the besieged city. Civilian authorities recognized the importance of protecting the youngest residents. Shelters were reinforced, hospitals prioritized pediatric care, and volunteers worked to locate and reunite families torn apart by the chaos. Every ration delivered to a child, every warm blanket provided, and every lesson taught in makeshift schools represented an act of defiance against the siege and a commitment to the city's future. Even amid tragedy, the children of Leningrad displayed an inspiring human ingenuity. Some scavenged for edible plants or roots, while others created simple toys or games to maintain morale. Their ability to adapt to extreme deprivation and danger became a quiet but powerful symbol of resilience, echoing the broader endurance of the city itself. By the end of the first harsh winter, it was clear that the children of Leningrad had not only survived physically but had developed skills and fortitude that would sustain them through the remainder of the 900-day siege. Their experiences were simultaneously heartbreaking and inspiring, reflecting the dual nature of life in the besieged city, immense suffering tempered by human ingenuity, communal support, and indomitable spirit. In the streets, bunkers, and communal shelters, children became living symbols of Leningrad's endurance. Their survival was a testament to the city's collective determination, to the tireless efforts of parents, volunteers, and officials, and to the innate resilience of youth under extreme adversity. Even as hunger, disease, and the cold continued to claim lives, the children's ingenuity, courage, and adaptability offered a glimmer of hope, proof that the human spirit could endure even in the most dire circumstances. The siege had stripped away innocence, yet it also revealed extraordinary resilience. For those who survived, the memory of childhood spent under fire, starvation, and snow became a lifelong mark of courage. The youngest residents of Leningrad had endured conditions that tested both body and mind, learning survival in its most extreme form. Their stories stand as a poignant reminder that even amid the darkest human suffering, courage, ingenuity, and the will to survive can persist, shaping the legacy of a city under siege. By the onset of the second winter of the siege, spanning 1942 to 1943, Leningrad had endured months of relentless starvation, bombardment, and freezing temperatures. The city's population, now seasoned by hardship, had developed systems of endurance and survival that allowed life to continue despite the ever-present specter of death. Yet German forces remained determined to crush the city through a combination of blockade, artillery, and aerial attacks, aiming to starve the population into submission while systematically targeting industrial and civilian infrastructure. The bombardments continued without respite. German artillery pounded the outskirts and key districts, while Luftwaffe raids struck residential areas, factories, and railways. Each shell or bomb that fell left devastation in its wake, collapsed buildings, shattered windows, and ruptured pipelines, compounding the scarcity of resources and threatening the fragile supply of heating and water. Citizens became adept at rapid response, evacuating homes, reinforcing basements and shelters, and improvising repairs to critical infrastructure immediately after each attack. Amid the destruction, civilians persisted in maintaining the lifeblood of the city. Factories continued to produce weapons, ammunition, and essential goods despite the constant threat of bombardment and dwindling resources. Workers endured exhaustion, hunger, and exposure to freezing temperatures while ensuring that production lines remained operational. Engineers repaired power lines, water distribution systems, and transportation routes, allowing the city to function as best as possible under siege conditions. Hospitals remained open, though overcrowded and undersupplied, with medical staff performing surgeries, delivering babies, and treating frostbite and malnutrition with extreme ingenuity. The city's administrative apparatus also continued its extraordinary work. Municipal authorities managed rationing, coordinated supply distribution, and organized public services despite limited manpower and resources. Volunteers assisted in clearing debris, delivering fuel, and providing emergency medical assistance. Every coordinated effort, no matter how small, contributed to the resilience and continuity of urban life. Even in the face of starvation, disease, and bombardment, the citizens of Leningrad refused to let the siege completely disrupt daily existence. Signs of hope began to emerge during this period. Soviet counteroffensives, though not yet capable of breaking the blockade, began to exert pressure on German positions surrounding the city. Reconnaissance and intelligence reports indicated German forces were overextended and facing logistical challenges, hinting that the encirclement might not be sustainable indefinitely. These reports, cautiously disseminated among military planners and city authorities, provided a psychological boost to civilians and defenders alike, suggesting that survival was not merely a temporary struggle, but a possible long-term outcome. The winter itself, though harsh, played a dual role. While freezing temperatures and blizzards exacerbated the suffering of Leningrad's inhabitants, the same cold and snow hindered German operations. Transportation of artillery, supplies, and reinforcements across frozen terrain became increasingly difficult, limiting the effectiveness of German attempts to tighten the blockade. The city's defenders leveraged these conditions, using frozen rivers and lakes as supply routes while fortifying positions with ice and snow barriers to slow any incursions. Despite the ongoing hardships, the population displayed remarkable stoic endurance. Children attended improvised schools whenever possible, continuing their education amid rationing and cold. Artists, musicians, and writers maintained cultural activities to sustain morale, performing in bombed-out buildings and shelters. Even the smallest acts, sharing a loaf of bread, assisting a neighbor, or lighting a candle in a basement shelter, became acts of resistance against the siege's physical and psychological pressure. The cumulative effect of these efforts was a city that functioned under extraordinary duress, with civilians, workers, and military personnel all contributing to its resilience. While malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion remained constant threats, the systems of rationing, civil defense, and industrial continuity allowed Leningrad to endure the second winter with a measure of stability. The early counteroffensives hinted at the possibility of relief, reinforcing the population's determination to persist. By the end of 1942 and into early 1943, the citizens and defenders of Leningrad had learned to survive under circumstances that would have overwhelmed most populations. Their adaptation included careful rationing, improvisation of heating and food sources, maintaining infrastructure, and supporting each other psychologically and physically. The city had become a fortress not only of concrete and steel but of human endurance, where the daily struggle for survival forged extraordinary resilience. The winter of 1942-43 thus marked a critical period in the siege. German attempts to starve and bomb the city continued, yet Leningrad persisted. Civilians, workers, and soldiers maintained the city's operational functions, the industrial output, and morale in the face of constant danger. Meanwhile, the first glimmers of hope appeared as Soviet forces began their counteroffensives, suggesting that the encirclement, no matter how harsh, might not last forever. In sum, this winter illustrated the indomitable spirit of Leningrad, a city under siege, battered by cold and deprivation, yet united in purpose and resilient in the face of overwhelming adversity. It was a winter of endurance, ingenuity, and courage, laying the foundation for the city's eventual survival and the eventual lifting of the siege that would define the 900-day struggle for life, hope, and dignity. By January 1943, after more than 16 months of relentless encirclement, starvation, and bombardment, Leningrad's situation began to show the first glimmers of hope. The siege, which had tested the endurance of every resident and defender, was far from over, but the partial breakthrough by Soviet forces provided a critical lifeline that allowed supplies to reach the city and eased, if only slightly, the suffering of its inhabitants. The breakthrough came in the form of a narrow corridor along the southern approaches of the city, a precarious and dangerous route that connected Leningrad to Soviet-held territory beyond the German encirclement. This corridor allowed trucks, sleds, and small convoys to deliver food, medicine, and other essential supplies into the heart of the city. While the corridor was often under threat from artillery and air raids, its existence represented a lifeline, a tangible sign that the blockade was not invincible, and that survival was possible. Food supplies, though still severely limited, began to trickle in through the corridor. Flour, grains, and essential rations reached bakeries and communal kitchens, allowing authorities to increase daily allocations slightly and provide minimal relief to those who had been subsisting on starvation-level rations for months. Hospitals received desperately needed medical supplies, enabling doctors and nurses to treat frostbite, disease, and malnutrition more effectively. Even this small improvement had a significant psychological impact, offering residents a sense of possibility and renewed morale. The civilian population responded to the partial relief with cautious optimism. While many remained wary, aware that the corridor could be cut off at any moment, the arrival of supplies instilled a renewed sense of hope and determination. Families shared news of food deliveries, volunteers assisted in distribution, and community networks strengthened to ensure that the meager provisions reached those most in need. This small reprieve reminded Leningraders that survival was achievable even under the harshest conditions. The corridor's existence also had military significance. Soviet troops, using the partial breakthrough, began reinforcing defensive positions within the city and preparing for gradual counteroffensives. Supplies reaching Leningrad allowed soldiers to maintain their posts, repair fortifications, and sustain artillery and small arms. Morale among the defenders improved slightly, as they could now see that the outside world was still engaged in the fight, and that the blockade was no longer absolute. However, the siege was far from over. German forces maintained artillery bombardments, air raids, and attempts to disrupt supply lines. The corridor was narrow and vulnerable, and winter conditions made travel treacherous. Convoys often moved slowly, with drivers and volunteers risking frostbite, snowstorms, and enemy fire to ensure that food and medical aid reached the city. Every successful crossing became an act of courage, every delivery a small victory against the prolonged siege. The partial relief also highlighted the resilience and ingenuity of the city's residents. People organized themselves to maximize the benefits of the incoming supplies, prioritizing children, the elderly, and the most vulnerable. Communal kitchens expanded operations, hospitals rationed resources efficiently, and citizens maintained civic order despite months of deprivation. The combination of external aid and internal coordination allowed the city to withstand the winter's harshest months with a renewed, if fragile, sense of endurance. In the streets, the arrival of even limited supplies brought cautious celebrations. Bread lines moved more quickly, and families shared meager but slightly more substantial meals. Conversations among neighbors reflected both relief and the lingering anxiety. The siege could resume in full force if the corridor was disrupted. Yet, the psychological effect was undeniable. For the first time in many months, Leningraders could envision a future beyond immediate survival. This partial breakthrough also served as a symbol of Soviet resilience and strategic planning. The Red Army's ability to open even a narrow corridor demonstrated that German forces, despite their encirclement, were not invincible. Intelligence, coordination, and persistence had created an opportunity to alleviate the city's suffering, reinforcing the belief that the siege could eventually be lifted entirely. By the end of January 1943, the city had achieved a delicate balance. It remained under siege, yet the worst effects of starvation and deprivation were beginning to ease. The corridor allowed not only supplies but also a psychological lifeline, reminding the people of Leningrad that perseverance, courage, and unity could sustain them through the darkest months. The partial relief of January 1943 marked a turning point in endurance, if not in freedom. While the blockade continued and conditions remained harsh, the arrival of food, medical supplies, and hope reminded the city that survival was possible. It was a small victory against overwhelming odds, a testament to human resilience, and a precursor to the eventual full lifting of the siege. Leningraders understood that the path ahead remained difficult, but for the first time in over a year, they could glimpse a future in which the city, and its people, would endure. The road of life, even in its limited capacity, had begun to fulfill its purpose, keeping Leningrad alive, sustaining its defenders, and rekindling the first sparks of hope amidst despair. The city, battered but unbroken, demonstrated that even in the darkest hours, determination, courage, and ingenuity could carve out a lifeline from the jaws of near-certain starvation. The 900-day siege of Leningrad stands as one of the most harrowing episodes of human endurance in modern history. Over nearly 3 years, the city endured relentless bombardment, starvation, disease, and bitter winters, claiming the lives of over 1 million civilians and soldiers. Yet amid the unimaginable suffering, the people of Leningrad demonstrated extraordinary heroism, resilience, and collective determination, forging a legacy that would be preserved and honored for generations. The human toll of the siege was staggering. Starvation ravaged families, leaving children malnourished and elderly residents unable to withstand the cold. Disease ran rampant, exacerbated by the overcrowded shelters, inadequate medical supplies, and extreme malnutrition. Frostbite and exposure claimed countless lives during the harsh winters, while constant artillery bombardments and aerial attacks added to the physical and psychological trauma. Streets became graveyards, hospitals overflowed, and makeshift morgues struggled to accommodate the dead. Yet even in the face of these horrors, the citizens of Leningrad refused to surrender, creating a remarkable testament to human endurance. Amid these hardships, acts of heroism and solidarity emerged. Civilians organized communal kitchens, scavenged supplies, and tended to the sick and wounded. Soldiers maintained defensive positions under extreme deprivation, often risking their lives to protect civilians and infrastructure. Volunteers braved freezing conditions to traverse Lake Ladoga, ensuring that the road of life continued to deliver essential food and supplies. These acts of courage and ingenuity, small and large, sustained the city when hope seemed lost. The memory of Leningrad's siege has been preserved through diaries, letters, and oral histories, capturing the individual experiences of those who lived through the ordeal. Personal accounts reveal both the physical suffering endured and the psychological resilience required to survive. Children wrote about days spent scavenging for scraps, women documented the communal efforts to distribute food, and soldiers recorded their vigilance under bombardment. Together, these narratives provide an intimate portrait of life during the blockade, allowing future generations to understand the cost of war beyond statistics and strategic reports. Museums and memorials throughout Russia serve as tangible reminders of the siege. Exhibits display rations, clothing, weapons, and personal items recovered from the city, illustrating the daily struggles and triumphs of Leningrad's residents. Monuments honor both the soldiers and civilians who endured starvation and death, ensuring that their sacrifices are not forgotten. Public commemorations, including ceremonies on the anniversary of the blockade's lifting, reinforce collective memory and serve as a bridge between the past and present. Beyond commemoration, the siege offers profound lessons in resilience, strategy, and human will. Militarily, Leningrad demonstrates the significance of urban defense, logistical planning under extreme duress, and the importance of maintaining morale during prolonged conflict. Civilians' ingenuity in rationing, constructing shelters, and supporting one another highlights the critical role of community cohesion and survival. Psychologically, the siege underscores the human capacity to endure suffering through solidarity, hope, and purposeful action, even when the situation appears hopeless. The enduring impact of the siege also lies in its moral and symbolic significance. Leningrad's survival against overwhelming odds became a powerful symbol of Soviet resilience and determination, galvanizing the population and serving as a rallying point for national pride. Internationally, the siege illustrated the extreme human cost of war and the consequences of totalitarian aggression, influencing both public perception and post-war military strategies. As survivors aged, their memories and testimonies became vital tools for education and remembrance. Schools and universities incorporated the stories of Leningrad into curricula, emphasizing lessons in courage, endurance, and the importance of solidarity under extreme conditions. Historians documented the siege in extensive research, preserving detailed accounts of both military operations and civilian experiences, ensuring that the human stories remain central to understanding this historic event. The city itself bears the physical legacy of the siege. Buildings repaired after bombardments still bear scars, and certain streets and neighborhoods serve as reminders of where hardships were most acute. Yet the most profound memorial exists in the stories of the people. Their perseverance, ingenuity, and survival are immortalized in the collective consciousness of Russia and the world. In reflection, the siege of Leningrad was not only a story of suffering and death but also one of extraordinary human endurance. The 900 days tested the limits of physical, mental, and social resilience. Civilians and soldiers alike demonstrated courage, solidarity, and determination that transcended the immediate horrors of starvation, bombardment, and cold. The legacy of Leningrad endures today as a lesson in perseverance, a reminder of the cost of war, and a tribute to those who survived and those who did not. Through diaries, museums, memorials, and public memory, the city's story continues to inspire, teaching that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can endure, adapt, and survive. Leningrad's ordeal is a testament to the power of community, courage, and will, a lesson as relevant now as it was amid the snow, starvation, and siege of 1941 to 1944. By the latter months of 1941, Leningrad's siege had intensified, and the city faced the harsh reality that survival was no longer merely threatened by bombs or artillery, but by starvation and disease. Daily life became a relentless struggle to secure even the bare minimum of sustenance. Bread, the staple of survival, was rationed to dangerously low levels, often no more than 125 grams per day for adults, and even less for children. Residents scavenged wherever they could, frozen canals yielded occasional fish, trees provided bark for subsistence bread, and any available animal was pressed into service for food. Hunger quickly manifested in physical deterioration. Malnutrition left civilians weak, frail, and prone to illness. The immune system, compromised by inadequate nutrition, was unable to fight off disease effectively. Typhus, dysentery, and respiratory infections spread rapidly in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of bombed-out apartments and shelters. Frostbite and exposure from inadequate heating compounded the crisis, leading to increasing mortality among the most vulnerable, children, the elderly, and the infirm. The streets themselves became grim indicators of the siege's toll. Bodies of those who had succumbed to hunger or cold littered sidewalks, courtyards, and stairwells. In some neighborhoods, families were too weak or too fearful to remove the deceased, and corpses were left where they fell. Makeshift morgues and mass graves were hastily established, often dug by neighbors or volunteers in frozen soil. The sight of accumulated bodies was a daily, unrelenting reminder of the siege's lethal consequences and an ever-present source of psychological trauma for the living. Civil defense and municipal authorities struggled to manage the increasing mortality. Hospitals, already overtaxed by bomb casualties, were overwhelmed with patients suffering from starvation, frostbite, and disease. Medical personnel, working without adequate supplies or heating, improvised treatments and triaged care to maximize the number of lives saved. Corpses were burned or buried as quickly as possible, but the sheer volume of deaths made proper funerary care impossible. This grim reality emphasized the scale of the siege's human cost. Death was omnipresent, and survival required constant vigilance and ingenuity. Despite the escalating crisis, Leningraders exhibited remarkable resourcefulness and solidarity. Neighborhood committees and volunteers organized food distribution, scavenged supplies, and assisted the sick and elderly. Communal kitchens, often improvised in basements or public buildings, provided a meager yet critical source of nourishment. Families shared their rations and cared for one another, forging bonds that reinforced communal survival. These efforts mitigated some of the suffering, though the city's population continued to shrink under the relentless pressures of hunger and cold. The psychological toll on the city was profound. The constant sight of suffering and death, combined with extreme deprivation, created widespread despair. Children witnessed parents and neighbors weaken and die, while adults faced the impossible choice of sacrificing their own sustenance for the vulnerable. Anxiety, hopelessness, and grief were pervasive, yet a collective determination to survive persisted, reinforced by a sense of civic duty, patriotism, and communal identity. Hunger altered the social fabric of the city. Crime and desperation occasionally rose, as some residents resorted to scavenging or theft to survive. Yet alongside these acts of survival, countless examples of bravery and selflessness emerged. Citizens risked their lives to deliver supplies, care for the sick, and bury the dead, creating networks of mutual aid that became the backbone of Leningrad's endurance. The harsh winter compounded the crisis, as frigid temperatures exacerbated the effects of malnutrition and disease. Streets iced over, making travel for work or food collection perilous. Frostbite and hypothermia claimed additional victims, and the lack of fuel for heating rendered homes virtually uninhabitable. Children and the elderly were particularly vulnerable, requiring continuous protection from neighbors and volunteers. As the days wore on, the cumulative effect of starvation and disease became apparent. Mortality rates climbed, hospitals overflowed, and municipal authorities struggled to maintain order and hygiene. Bodies were removed from streets and courtyards only to be interred hastily in mass graves, and the very process of survival, securing enough food, maintaining warmth, and protecting the young, became a monumental daily endeavor. Yet, despite the grim reality, the people of Leningrad demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Communities rallied together, creating organized ration distribution, sharing resources, and improvising medical care. Workers, volunteers, and soldiers alike contributed to the city's collective survival. Even in the face of escalating death, the citizens refused to surrender, holding on to hope and unity. The period marked a critical phase of the siege, where starvation and disease became as lethal as any artillery shell. Leningrad's population was tested physically, mentally, and emotionally, yet the city endured. The first wave of mass casualties illustrated the sheer scale of the siege's horror, but also highlighted the extraordinary human capacity for adaptation, endurance, and solidarity under conditions that would have crushed most communities. In summary, the escalation of starvation and disease in Leningrad transformed daily life into a struggle for mere survival. Every meal, every heated room, and every ration scrap became a lifeline. The city's streets, lined with the dead and dying, bore silent witness to the human cost of war. And yet, even amid this harrowing reality, the people of Leningrad persevered, innovated, and supported one another, forging a legacy of endurance and courage that would define the 900-day siege and echo through history as a testament to human resilience in the face of unrelenting suffering. As the siege of Leningrad dragged into its first bitter winter, the city's defenders took extraordinary measures to resist the encroaching German and Finnish forces. Survival would depend not only on the civilians' endurance against starvation and cold but also on the strategic and tactical resilience of the Soviet military, which worked tirelessly to fortify the city from within. Every street, every building, and every square inch of Leningrad became a potential battlefield, as soldiers and civilians alike joined forces to repel attacks and sustain the city's defenses. Soviet troops, deployed throughout Leningrad, immediately set to work reinforcing the city's fortifications. Trenches were dug along the outskirts and around key infrastructure, while barricades of sandbags, rubble, and timber were erected to impede any potential German breakthrough. Artillery positions were carefully placed to cover major avenues of approach, railways, and bridges, ensuring overlapping fields of fire that maximized defensive effectiveness. Snipers took positions in rooftops, attics, and partially destroyed buildings, targeting enemy scouts and artillery spotters, making every inch of the city a potential trap for advancing troops. The military defense relied not only on static fortifications but also on dynamic and adaptive tactics. Soviet commanders organized mobile reserves within the city, ready to respond to any breach attempt or concentrated attack. Patrols moved through streets and alleyways, communicating via runners and signal systems when telegraph lines were cut. Soldiers were trained to operate under extreme cold and limited supplies, adapting to shortages of ammunition and food while maintaining vigilance against enemy reconnaissance and sabotage. Civilians played an indispensable role in the city's defense. They participated in the construction of fortifications, helping to carry sand, rubble, and timber for barricades, dig trenches, and reinforce weak points along the perimeter. Neighborhood committees coordinated volunteer labor, ensuring that areas near schools, hospitals, and residential buildings were adequately fortified. In some cases, civilians were enlisted to man anti-aircraft weapons or assist in logistics, distributing rations to troops and transporting supplies to frontline positions. Their involvement blurred the line between civilian and soldier, emphasizing that the defense of Leningrad was a collective effort. The integration of civilians into the defense effort also had a psychological impact, fostering a sense of shared purpose and unity. Every individual, from factory workers to students, understood that their actions contributed directly to the survival of their families, friends, and city. Children carried sandbags, women reinforced buildings, and volunteers maintained communications and supply routes. This civic engagement created a collective morale that countered the despair caused by starvation, cold, and constant bombardment. Soviet artillery and defensive measures proved remarkably effective against the encircling German forces. Barges targeted supply lines and artillery positions, while snipers disrupted reconnaissance and troop movements. Even when German soldiers managed to advance, they encountered improvised traps, barricades, and fortified positions that slowed their progress and inflicted casualties. The city's layered defenses ensured that every attempt to break the encirclement required significant effort and resources, frustrating enemy planners and buying precious time for civilians and reinforcements. Urban terrain offered unique advantages. Apartment buildings, factories, and warehouses were converted into defensive strongpoints. Rooftops and windows served as sniper nests, while basements became command posts and emergency hospitals. Soldiers adapted to close-quarters combat in streets and alleyways, employing ambushes and improvised explosives to repel incursions. Every structure and object, from overturned carts to rubble, became a tool for survival, transforming Leningrad into a fortress city where resistance was embedded in the environment itself. Coordination between military units and civilian efforts was critical. Engineers worked to repair damage from bombardments, maintaining communication lines and transportation routes essential for troop mobility and supply distribution. Civilians helped transport sandbags, carry water, and support medical teams, allowing soldiers to remain at frontline positions for longer periods. This cooperation strengthened both morale and practical defense capabilities, emphasizing the interdependence of military and civilian resilience. Despite extreme deprivation, the defenders maintained vigilance and discipline. Food scarcity, freezing temperatures, and disease posed constant challenges, yet soldiers and volunteers remained steadfast in their duties. Night watches, patrols, and emergency response teams ensured that no breach went unnoticed, and artillery and sniper teams responded rapidly to any threat. The city's defense became a cohesive organism, where the survival of one relied on the diligence of many. The first months of fortified resistance demonstrated the extraordinary courage of Leningrad's population. Even as German bombardments continued and the cold claimed lives, the city held firm. Every barricade reinforced, every trench dug, and every patrol conducted represented both practical defense and a psychological statement. Leningrad would not yield, and its citizens and defenders were prepared to endure unimaginable hardship. By integrating military strategy, civilian labor, and urban ingenuity, Leningrad established one of the most remarkable defensive efforts of the Second World War. The city had transformed itself into a living fortress, where solidarity, courage, and adaptability enabled survival under conditions that seemed designed to break the human spirit. Soldiers defended streets and key positions, civilians reinforced infrastructure and supported operations, and the city collectively demonstrated that endurance and cooperation could resist the most extreme trials. The military defense of Leningrad, in combination with the courage and resourcefulness of its citizens, ensured that the city could withstand the ongoing siege. Snipers, artillery, barricades, and improvised fortifications slowed the German advance, while civilians' participation reinforced the city's resilience. This unified effort became a testament to human courage and collective action under extreme duress, laying the foundation for the city's eventual survival and immortalizing Leningrad as a symbol of defiance, endurance, and unity in the face of almost unimaginable adversity. By the height of Leningrad's second winter, the city's survival relied upon one of the most extraordinary feats of human endurance and ingenuity in modern warfare: the transportation of supplies and evacuation of civilians across frozen Lake Ladoga. The lake, the largest in Europe, became both a barrier and a lifeline, as its ice offered a rare route through which desperately needed provisions could reach the besieged population. The operation, known as the Road of Life, was a constant struggle against nature, enemy action, and the limits of human endurance. The frozen surface of Lake Ladoga transformed into a precarious highway. In theory, trucks, sleds, and small boats could move across the ice, bringing in food, coal, and medical supplies while evacuating children, the elderly, and other vulnerable civilians. In practice, each journey was fraught with extreme danger. Cracks in the ice, hidden pressure points, and drifting snow made navigation perilous, while blizzards reduced visibility to near zero. Drivers and crews were forced to rely on experience, compasses, and improvised markers to traverse the frozen expanse safely. Any misstep could plunge a vehicle and its passengers into the freezing waters, a certain death in the bitter cold. the threat of enemy attacks added another layer of peril. German artillery and air raids targeted convoys as they crossed the ice, attempting to disrupt the city's fragile lifeline. Bombs, strafing runs, and long-range shelling made each crossing a tense gamble. Convoy leaders coordinated meticulously, moving in groups to provide mutual protection and minimize exposure to enemy fire. Despite these dangers, hundreds of drivers, sailors, and volunteers braved the treacherous conditions repeatedly, their courage and endurance sustaining the city in ways that would ultimately define Leningrad's resistance. The logistical challenge was immense. Supplies had to be calculated with precision, with every kilogram of food or fuel making the difference between life and death for civilians and defenders. Vehicles were loaded to capacity, often in freezing temperatures that made engines difficult to start and operate. Drivers wrapped in multiple layers of clothing endured numb fingers and toes, yet pressed on, knowing that the survival of thousands depended on their success. Even minor delays or mechanical failures could prove catastrophic, as enemy fire or thin ice might strike at any moment. Civilians played a vital role in this operation. Many volunteered to assist in loading and unloading supplies, guiding convoys, and helping to evacuate vulnerable populations. Children, despite the harsh conditions, sometimes assisted with minor tasks, delivering messages, or helping in communal kitchens that received supplies. Community coordination and local knowledge were critical, ensuring that the lifeline functioned despite the dangers and limitations of winter and enemy action. The psychological effect of the road of life was profound. For the citizens of Leningrad, seeing supplies arrive across the ice offered a rare glimmer of hope amid months of deprivation. It reminded them that they were not entirely cut off, that the Red Army and their fellow citizens outside the city were still engaged in the fight. For those making the journey across the lake, the mission carried a tremendous sense of responsibility. Each successful delivery or evacuation represented a life saved and a step toward the city's endurance. Extreme weather conditions compounded the peril. Sub-zero temperatures caused fuel lines to freeze, engines to stall, and mechanical parts to become brittle. Drivers and volunteers risked frostbite or hypothermia with every journey. Blizzards frequently blanketed the ice, obscuring landmarks and making navigation treacherous. Yet despite these conditions, operations continued nearly around the clock, a testament to the resilience and determination of those keeping the lifeline open. The road of life also served a symbolic function. It represented defiance against both nature and the enemy, demonstrating that Leningrad, though besieged, would not surrender without extraordinary effort. Every convoy that crossed the ice reinforced the city's morale, reminding residents that survival was still possible and that their collective endurance mattered. The sight of returning trucks laden with flour, bread, and coal brought a brief reprieve to families and soldiers alike, reinforcing a sense of shared purpose and solidarity. By early 1942, the frozen transport across Lake Ladoga had become the city's most critical supply route, delivering thousands of tons of food, fuel, and medical supplies while evacuating tens of thousands of civilians. Despite the constant danger, it allowed the city to sustain itself through the coldest and most lethal months of the siege. The ingenuity, courage, and sacrifice of those involved became emblematic of Leningrad's extraordinary resilience under pressure. In conclusion, the frozen expanse of Lake Ladoga was more than just a geographical feature, it was a lifeline, a battleground, and a test of human ingenuity and bravery. Civilians and soldiers faced freezing temperatures, enemy fire, and mechanical hazards to keep the city alive. The road of life exemplified the tense heroism and endurance that allowed Leningrad to survive, proving that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, human determination and courage could prevail. The success of this route preserved not only the physical lives of the city's residents but also the spirit and hope of a population under siege, laying the foundation for Leningrad's eventual survival. During the long and harrowing siege of Leningrad, children bore some of the harshest burdens, yet their experiences also revealed the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. As the city endured encirclement by German and Finnish forces, combined with relentless artillery bombardments, extreme winter conditions, and a near-total shortage of food, the youngest residents faced starvation, disease, and exposure on a scale few could imagine. Their vulnerability was profound, yet their ingenuity and courage in response became a striking testament to human endurance. Starvation hit children disproportionately. Even small reductions in rations had devastating effects on growth, immunity, and energy. Many were reduced to consuming minimal portions of black bread, supplemented with roots, grasses, or anything edible scavenged from the frozen city. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, leaving children susceptible to typhus, dysentery, and respiratory illnesses, which spread quickly through overcrowded shelters and makeshift orphanages. The sick often remained untreated, as medical supplies were limited and hospitals overwhelmed. Frostbite and hypothermia claimed additional victims, particularly those too young to generate enough body heat or unable to secure adequate clothing. Orphanages became critical havens, though they too faced severe challenges. Staff worked tirelessly to stretch meager rations, often improvising substitute foods such as sawdust-laced bread or boiled roots. Sleeping arrangements were crowded, heating was minimal, and sanitary conditions were precarious. Despite these hardships, orphanage workers sought to maintain a sense of routine, education, and normalcy, understanding that psychological resilience was as vital as physical survival. Children were encouraged to help with daily chores, learn basic skills, and care for younger or weaker peers, fostering responsibility and cooperation amidst deprivation. Stories of resilience and ingenuity among the city's children became emblematic of the siege itself. Children learned to adapt to extreme scarcity, finding creative ways to supplement their rations, whether by fishing in frozen canals, collecting firewood, or sharing food among siblings and friends. Some improvised games and exercises to maintain physical strength and morale, while others assisted adults in labor, delivery of supplies, or care for the ill. These small acts of creativity and courage helped sustain not only their own survival but also that of their families and communities. Community solidarity played a significant role in supporting children. Neighborhood committees and volunteer networks ensured that rations were distributed fairly, and that orphans, disabled children, and those without family care received assistance. Schools, where operational, incorporated lessons in survival, hygiene, and first aid alongside literacy and numeracy, emphasizing both practical and psychological skills. Religious institutions, though limited, provided spiritual support and small educational activities to maintain hope. Despite the severe hardships, children often demonstrated remarkable bravery and mental resilience. They learned to navigate a city filled with collapsed buildings, frozen streets, and dangerous debris while avoiding enemy bombardments and navigating ration lines. Their ability to endure extreme hunger, freezing temperatures, and constant uncertainty reflected a combination of innate adaptability and the guidance of adults who fostered communal solidarity. The psychological toll on children was significant. Witnessing death, starvation, and despair daily created lasting trauma. Yet, these young survivors also developed a profound sense of agency and empathy. They assisted others when possible, shared rations, and comforted peers in distress. The siege forced them to mature rapidly, blending childhood innocence with the harsh necessities of survival. In many ways, the experiences of children mirrored the city itself, fragile yet resilient, vulnerable yet resourceful, overwhelmed yet unbroken. Their daily survival required ingenuity, courage, and community support, a microcosm of Leningrad's broader struggle. Even in the darkest moments, small victories, such as a shared meal, a warm blanket, or a safe night in a shelter, became triumphs of human spirit. By sustaining life under these conditions, the children of Leningrad also symbolized hope for the city's future. Each child who survived the harsh winters and malnutrition represented the persistence of human potential and the possibility of rebuilding a society scarred by war. Their survival became a measure of the city's endurance, a reminder that even amid devastation, life and human ingenuity could persist. In conclusion, the children of Leningrad during the siege were exposed to unimaginable hardships, starvation, disease, exposure, and the psychological trauma of living under constant threat. Yet they demonstrated extraordinary resilience, creativity, and courage. Orphanages improvised care, communities pooled resources, and children adapted to extreme circumstances with ingenuity. Their endurance under such conditions reflects both the tragedy and the inspiring human spirit that defined Leningrad's survival. The story of these children is a poignant reminder that even in the face of prolonged deprivation and imminent danger, human resilience can manifest in the youngest among us, shaping the legacy of a city that refused to yield. They became both witnesses and symbols of courage, illuminating the possibility of survival and hope amidst one of history's most devastating sieges. Amid the unrelenting siege of Leningrad, the city's factories became critical lifelines, sustaining both the military defense and the survival of the civilian population. Despite dwindling food supplies, sub-zero temperatures, and constant bombardment from German and Finnish forces, industrial production continued, a testament to the stoic endurance and determination of Leningrad's workforce. These factories did not simply produce goods, they produced hope, resilience, and the means for the city to resist total collapse. At the onset of the siege, the city's industrial complex was rapidly reorganized to meet the demands of wartime survival. Factories that once produced consumer goods were converted to manufacture weapons, ammunition, and essential military supplies. Even small workshops contributed by repairing machinery, producing spare parts, and improvising solutions to compensate for shortages of raw materials. Every rivet, every shell, and every bolt was a tangible contribution to the defense of the city, reinforcing both the military front and the collective morale of the population. The workforce itself was remarkable. Men, women, and even teenagers labored under extreme conditions to keep production lines running. Despite chronic hunger, frostbite, and exhaustion, they maintained long shifts, often in poorly heated buildings where machinery groaned and threatened to freeze. Women took on roles traditionally reserved for men, operating heavy equipment, managing logistical operations, and ensuring that essential goods reached military units and civilian distribution centers. Teenagers assisted with assembly, transport, and maintenance, demonstrating an early maturity forced upon them by the extraordinary circumstances. The challenges were immense. Fuel shortages limited the operation of machinery, while damaged equipment from previous bombardments required constant repair and improvisation. Electrical failures were common, as the city's power infrastructure was stretched thin, and factories had to rely on generators or manual labor to maintain production. Bombings posed another constant threat. Air raid alarms would halt work suddenly, and crews would rush to shelters, only to return and resume production immediately after, often without pause for rest or nourishment. Safety, though a concern, often took a back seat to the imperative of sustaining production. Workers braved cold, fatigue, and dangerous machinery, knowing that every item produced directly supported the city's defense, food distribution, or medical care. Factories became microcosms of the city's collective effort, places where human endurance, ingenuity, and perseverance converged in a relentless fight against both enemy action and the deprivation of siege life. In addition to military production, factories also contributed to civilian survival. Workshops and assembly lines manufactured stoves, cooking equipment, medical tools, and essential infrastructure components. Every item that enabled heating, cooking, or medical treatment indirectly saved lives, making the work of these factories central to sustaining both morale and physical survival. The line between military and civilian utility blurred, as each task became a lifeline for the besieged population. The human cost of this labor was high. Workers endured frostbite, malnutrition, and chronic exhaustion, with minimal rations barely sufficient to sustain long hours of physically demanding work. Disease spread quickly in crowded factory floors, and injuries from machinery or bombardment were common. Yet despite these hardships, productivity persisted, driven by a combination of civic duty, patriotism, and the stark realization that the survival of the city depended on their labor. Leadership within factories displayed remarkable adaptability. Managers coordinated schedules to maximize output while accommodating shortages of fuel, electricity, and materials. Tasks were prioritized according to immediate military and civilian needs, ensuring that the most critical items were produced and distributed first. Improvisation became essential, as workers created makeshift tools, repaired damaged machinery, and substituted scarce raw materials with available alternatives. The factories also served as centers of psychological resilience. By continuing to work and produce, citizens maintained a sense of purpose amid the chaos, channeling fear and despair into tangible contributions to survival. Every shell produced, every repaired tool, every ration packaged for distribution reinforced the collective morale, signaling that the city, though besieged, was neither defeated nor passive. By the winter of 1942-43, the continued operation of factories demonstrated that Leningrad's survival relied as much on human industry as on military strategy. While German and Finnish forces sought to starve and destroy the city, the workers of Leningrad defied the odds, maintaining production under conditions that would have overwhelmed most urban populations. Their labor was a form of resistance, a daily assertion that the city would endure against starvation, cold, and relentless attack. In retrospect, these factories stand as monuments to human perseverance. They illustrate how collective effort, ingenuity, and unyielding commitment can sustain a city under siege. Civilians, women, and teenagers who labored tirelessly in freezing, dangerous conditions were as critical to Leningrad's endurance as the soldiers on the front lines. Each item produced, each repair completed, each ration packed, and every ounce of effort contributed directly to preserving life and maintaining the city's spirit. The story of Leningrad's factories during the siege is one of stoic endurance against impossible odds. Despite starvation, freezing temperatures, and the constant threat of bombardment, the people of the city continued to produce, repair, and sustain. Their work allowed the city to survive the darkest days of the blockade and stands as a testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and collective determination in the face of overwhelming adversity. Amid the relentless siege of Leningrad, while the city struggled to survive under starvation, bombardment, and sub-zero temperatures, the most intimate chronicles of human endurance were preserved not in official reports or military dispatches, but in the letters and diaries of its inhabitants. These personal documents, often hidden in basements, attics, or tucked away in pockets, provide a deeply human perspective on the extraordinary challenges of life under siege, capturing fear, hope, courage, and sorrow on a profoundly personal level. For many residents, writing became both a necessity and a solace. Daily life was dominated by the struggle for food, warmth, and safety, yet the act of putting pen to paper allowed people to maintain a connection to loved ones and to assert their humanity amidst the dehumanizing conditions of hunger and constant threat. Letters to family members, whether in other parts of the Soviet Union or within Leningrad itself, carried messages of encouragement, practical guidance, or reassurance. Some letters described the daily fight for survival, rationing bread, gathering firewood, or enduring the bitter cold, while others bore witness to losses, despair, or the death of friends and neighbors. Many letters were never delivered, lost amid the chaos of war, captured in the ruins of bombed-out buildings, or consumed by the impermanence of improvised mail routes. Yet even in their absence, these letters provide a vivid portrait of life under siege. A child writing to a distant relative might recount how classmates endured frostbite while huddling in unheated schools. A factory worker could describe the exhaustion and hunger endured while keeping munitions flowing to the front lines. Each note, whether hopeful or despairing, reflects the intimate struggles and resilience of individuals navigating the daily challenges of siege life. Diaries, often maintained in secret, offered a similar window into private experiences. Residents chronicled the rhythm of the city, the long hours waiting for ration lines, the constant vigilance against bombings, the improvised communal meals, and the psychological strain of watching neighbors succumb to hunger and cold. These personal accounts reveal a spectrum of emotion: fear for one's own survival, grief for lost loved ones, and awe at the courage displayed by neighbors, friends, and strangers. Many diarists noted small acts of kindness and solidarity, sharing the last portion of bread, carrying a sick neighbor to a hospital, or keeping morale high through storytelling or song. The letters and diaries also illuminate the psychological strategies people employed to cope with extreme conditions. Writing became a means of asserting control in a world that seemed increasingly uncontrollable. Some used humor to lighten the burden, others turned to poetry or sketches to process their emotions. Through their writings, citizens of Leningrad documented not just suffering but endurance, creativity, and a refusal to succumb entirely to despair. Families separated by the siege faced profound uncertainty. Letters often contained instructions for rationing, updates on health and survival, or expressions of longing. The inability to deliver messages compounded the anxiety, yet the mere act of writing reaffirmed the bonds of love, memory, and duty. Some letters describe the agony of knowing that food supplies would not be sufficient to keep children alive, yet also recount moments of courage, such as a parent giving up their own portion to feed a younger sibling. Soviet authorities encouraged correspondence when possible, recognizing that maintaining morale was critical. Postal workers and couriers risked artillery fire and bombing runs to deliver letters between the front lines and the city. Even small successes in communication provided tangible hope. A single letter confirming the survival of a loved one could bolster a family's determination to endure another day of rationed meals, freezing temperatures, and relentless bombardment. These personal documents highlight the universal human themes of the siege: love and loss, fear and courage, despair and hope. While statistics record deaths, malnutrition rates, and destroyed infrastructure, diaries and letters capture the texture of daily life, the emotional landscape, and the profound resilience required to survive. They provide a window into how ordinary people navigated extraordinary adversity, humanizing the larger narrative of a city under siege. The intimate nature of letters and diaries also personalizes the collective suffering. Each individual account adds depth to the historical record, illustrating that the siege was experienced not only as a military blockade but as a deeply personal trial for millions. Stories emerge of children hiding scraps of food, parents comforting the dying, neighbors sharing blankets, and soldiers risking their lives to protect civilians. These human details bring the abstract horror of the siege into vivid relief. In retrospect, the letters and diaries of Leningrad's citizens are invaluable. They document the endurance of the human spirit under extreme duress, providing insight into coping mechanisms, ingenuity, and communal solidarity. They show how individuals maintain their identity, humanity, and hope even when surrounded by death, cold, and starvation. Ultimately, these personal writings form a living memory of the siege, preserving both the suffering and the heroism of those who endured it. Through the words of ordinary people, historians, descendants, and the wider world can grasp the scale of the siege's challenges, the courage required to survive, and the resilience of a population that refused to yield. In this way, the diaries and letters of Leningrad's inhabitants do more than record history, they testify to the enduring strength of the human spirit amid one of the most extreme conditions of war. By the winter of 1942, Leningrad had entered the most grueling phase of its siege, a period that would come to define the city's endurance and the extraordinary resilience of its inhabitants. The combination of extreme cold, dwindling food supplies, and relentless bombardment created a crucible in which both civilians and soldiers were tested beyond what most could imagine. This winter would prove lethal for thousands, yet it also demonstrated the city's remarkable capacity to endure and adapt under extraordinary pressure. Temperatures plummeted to levels well below freezing, and the bitter cold exacerbated the effects of already scarce food. Heating was limited to a small fraction of households, and the fuel needed to keep furnaces burning was in short supply. Many families resorted to burning furniture, books, or even scraps of wood salvaged from rubble to stave off hypothermia. In factories, workshops, and hospitals, workers and medical staff shivered through long shifts, often without protective clothing, as they attempted to maintain the city's defenses, production lines, and medical care. Food shortages reached critical levels. Daily rations, already meager, were further reduced to stretch limited supplies. Bread, the staple of survival, was often mixed with sawdust or other fillers to extend portions, while small amounts of vegetables, roots, or scavenged food provided minimal supplementation. Starvation mortality surged during this period, as individuals weakened by malnutrition became increasingly susceptible to disease and frostbite. Corpses began accumulating in streets, stairwells, and homes, as municipal authorities struggled to bury the dead in frozen ground. Makeshift morgues and mass graves were hastily organized, highlighting the grim realities of daily life under siege. Hospitals and medical facilities were overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly, treating frostbite, malnutrition, and illnesses such as typhus and dysentery with minimal resources. Operating theaters were unheated, and surgical procedures were often conducted under candlelight or improvised lamps. Medical personnel themselves faced exhaustion, hunger, and cold, yet continued to serve patients at great personal risk. The scale of suffering taxed every available resource, creating an environment in which survival required ingenuity, cooperation, and unrelenting determination. The psychological impact of this harsh winter was profound. Citizens were acutely aware of the thin margin between life and death. Fear, grief, and despair were constant companions, as neighbors, friends, and family members succumbed to the twin threats of starvation and cold. Yet, even in these conditions, acts of solidarity emerged, communities shared rations, neighbors assisted with heating and shelter, and volunteers carried out essential services to maintain minimal functionality. These acts reinforced the city's cohesion and collective resolve, providing a psychological lifeline alongside the physical one. Civilians adapted in remarkable ways. They scavenged for food along frozen canals, collected firewood from ruined buildings, and improvised cooking methods. Children, though extremely vulnerable, contributed by assisting families, fetching supplies, or aiding in communal kitchens. These adaptations were not simply survival strategies, they were assertions of agency in a world that sought to strip life away, demonstrating the ingenuity and resilience of the human spirit under extreme duress. Soviet troops within the city also faced extreme challenges. Soldiers manned defensive positions in freezing temperatures, often with insufficient food and clothing, while maintaining readiness against potential German incursions. Artillery units and snipers continued to repel enemy reconnaissance and bombardments, relying on determination and experience to compensate for exhaustion and deprivation. The coordination between military personnel and civilians was crucial. The city's survival depended on the integration of defense, production, and resource distribution despite the severe winter conditions. The winter of 1942 was a test of endurance on every level: physical, psychological, and social. Survival was measured not just in avoiding death but in maintaining cohesion, purpose, and human dignity. Breadlines, communal kitchens, improvised shelters, and clandestine supply operations became essential lifelines. Communities adapted through cooperation, resourcefulness, and shared vigilance, ensuring that the city's most vulnerable received attention while the population collectively worked to sustain life. Despite the extreme hardships, Leningraders demonstrated remarkable resilience. People maintained cultural and educational activities, preserving a sense of normalcy and morale. Teachers, artists, and volunteers organized lessons, performances, and communal activities wherever possible, providing both distraction and psychological reinforcement. Every loaf of bread, every bundle of firewood, every act of assistance was a small triumph against a siege designed to destroy both body and spirit. By the end of this winter, it was clear that the most severe phase of the blockade had arrived, but so too had a deeper understanding of the city's capabilities to endure. While starvation, frostbite, and disease claimed many lives, the combination of civic organization, military defense, and human ingenuity allowed Leningrad to continue resisting. The city had become a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit, demonstrating that even under the most extreme environmental and military pressures, survival was possible. The winter of 1942 in Leningrad stands as a symbol of unrelenting human endurance. Every act of courage, every shared ration, and every improvised solution contributed to a larger effort to keep the city alive. This period of the siege illustrated both the cruelty of war and environment and the extraordinary capacity of a population to resist, adapt, and survive. Leningrad's citizens endured one of history's harshest winters, leaving a legacy of courage, ingenuity, and determination that would resonate long after the siege ended. In the frozen streets and bombed-out buildings of Leningrad, winter of 1942 brought not only hunger and disease but also extraordinary acts of human courage. Amid the pervasive suffering and death, both civilians and soldiers performed feats of heroism that became the backbone of the city's endurance. These actions, born of necessity and compassion, provided critical lifelines to the population and sustained hope in a city teetering on the brink of collapse. Civilians frequently risked their lives to deliver food, fuel, and medical supplies to those unable to reach distribution centers. Volunteers carried heavy sacks of bread through snowdrifts, guided elderly neighbors to ration points, and navigated treacherous streets littered with debris from German bombardments. Mothers, fathers, and teenagers alike braved the bitter cold and artillery fire, often walking miles to deliver a small portion of bread or warm clothing to a neighbor. Each delivery, no matter how small, represented a tangible act of defiance against the forces seeking to destroy the city. Nurses and medics were among the most visible heroes in Leningrad. Working in overcrowded hospitals and makeshift infirmaries, they treated frostbite, malnutrition, and infectious diseases without adequate supplies or heating. Candlelight or stoves powered by scant fuel served as the only source of light and warmth as they performed surgeries, dressed wounds, and comforted the dying. Many medics contracted illness themselves, yet continued to care for patients, often with the knowledge that their own survival was uncertain. Their dedication exemplified the human capacity to act selflessly even in the most extreme conditions. Soldiers defending Leningrad also exhibited extraordinary heroism beyond the battlefield. In addition to manning fortifications and artillery positions, they assisted in civilian rescue operations, clearing snow to maintain access to ration points, transporting fuel and food, and helping evacuate children or the infirm. Despite malnutrition and exhaustion, they persevered, driven by a profound sense of duty to protect the city and its population. These acts strengthened both the practical defense and the morale of the population, demonstrating that courage could flourish even amid despair. Some stories of heroism became legendary. Residents rescued neighbors trapped in collapsing buildings, delivered water and bread to isolated households, and improvised heating solutions for families huddled in freezing apartments. In the freezing streets, groups of volunteers formed human chains to pull sleds laden with food across icy roads. Each act, while small individually, collectively contributed to the survival of thousands and embodied the enduring spirit of solidarity in Leningrad. Children, too, played a role in these acts of courage. Despite being vulnerable to starvation and cold, they assisted families and neighbors by gathering firewood, helping in communal kitchens, or conveying messages across the city. Their participation illustrated that heroism in Leningrad was not limited by age. Survival depended on everyone contributing to the collective effort. The psychological impact of these heroic actions was profound. Witnessing acts of selflessness and bravery instilled a sense of hope and resilience in a population constantly confronted with death and deprivation. Every loaf of bread delivered, every injured child tended, every person rescued reinforced the belief that survival was possible and that the human spirit could endure even the harshest conditions. The courage displayed in Leningrad was not only physical but also moral. Many risked their own lives to protect the vulnerable, demonstrating that heroism could emerge not only in combat but also in acts of compassion and solidarity. This duality, the defense of life against both enemy fire and the ravages of hunger and cold, became a defining feature of the city's survival. By winter of 1942, these acts of heroism had become part of the city's collective identity. Stories were shared among neighbors, recorded in diaries, and transmitted through community networks, reinforcing the idea that every individual could make a difference. The bravery of ordinary citizens and soldiers inspired those around them, creating a ripple effect that strengthened communal endurance and sustained morale. In conclusion, the courage displayed amid the siege of Leningrad was a crucial element in the city's survival. Civilians, nurses, medics, soldiers, and even children performed extraordinary feats to save lives and maintain hope. These acts, often undertaken at great personal risk, exemplified the resilience, ingenuity, and determination that allowed Leningrad to endure one of the longest and most brutal sieges in history. In the harshest winter, amid hunger, disease, and bombardment, the human spirit shone brightly, proving that even in despair, acts of bravery and compassion could sustain life and preserve hope. By early 1943, after more than a year of siege, Leningrad's defenders and inhabitants faced a critical turning point as the Soviet military launched a series of coordinated artillery and airstrikes against the encircling German and Finnish forces. These operations aimed not only to weaken enemy positions but also to open limited corridors for supplies and reinforcements, offering the besieged city a glimmer of relief amidst relentless hardship. The combination of winter conditions, exhausted German troops, and strategic Soviet pressure created an environment in which hope and danger existed side by side. The Soviet counteroffensive relied heavily on artillery bombardments targeted at German fortifications and troop concentrations surrounding Leningrad. Thousands of shells rained down on forward positions, disrupting supply lines, destroying bunkers, and forcing the encircling forces to reorganize under fire. Artillery crews operated under severe conditions themselves, often in makeshift emplacements exposed to cold, snow, and enemy observation, yet they persisted, understanding that every successful strike could alleviate the suffering inside the city. Air power played an equally critical role. Soviet aircraft launched sorties against enemy positions and supply routes, aiming to cripple German logistics and morale. pilots braved freezing temperatures, anti-aircraft fire, and limited visibility to strike at encampments, artillery positions, and rail lines. Each successful mission disrupted the blockade and contributed to creating temporary corridors through which limited supplies could reach the city. The combined pressure of air and artillery forced German commanders to stretch their defenses, overextend their supply lines, and respond reactively rather than proactively. These operations allowed the Soviets to establish narrow corridors across which essential supplies and reinforcements could reach Leningrad. Though the openings were limited and dangerous, they were a lifeline. Trucks, sleds, and boats navigated these precarious routes, delivering food, fuel, and medical equipment to civilians and soldiers who had endured months of starvation and deprivation. Evacuation of vulnerable populations, including children and the sick, became possible through these narrow passages, saving countless lives and bolstering morale across the city. The pressure on German troops intensified. Already stretched thin by the severe winter and months of sustained operations, they faced repeated bombardments and harassment from Soviet forces. Morale began to waver as they realized the siege was no longer entirely under their control. German positions were forced to adjust constantly to counter Soviet advances, leaving gaps in the blockade that Leningrad's defenders could exploit. Even slight openings in the supply lines became critical lifelines, reinforcing both civilian endurance and military capability. For the residents of Leningrad, the combination of artillery and airstrikes brought a renewed sense of hope. While food remained scarce and winter continued to take its toll, the arrival of even limited rations and coal represented tangible evidence that the siege was not absolute. Families who had endured months of hunger and frost could now see that relief was possible, and the psychological boost of these small successes helped sustain the population through the continuing hardships. Civilians actively participated in supporting these efforts. Volunteers helped unload supplies, transport rations through the city, and repair infrastructure damaged by bombardments. Factories and workshops prioritized the production of items needed to sustain the defenders and maintain essential services. The coordination between military action and civilian resilience demonstrated the interdependence of all elements of the city's survival strategy. The winter conditions, though slightly mitigated as the cold began to soften, still posed significant obstacles. Snow and ice made transportation slow and dangerous, while freezing temperatures continued to exacerbate malnutrition and illness. Nevertheless, the combination of strategic Soviet strikes and the resulting supply corridors represented a turning point in the siege's dynamics, offering Leningrad a chance to recover just enough to endure the remaining months. In essence, the Soviet artillery and air campaigns of early 1943 were more than tactical operations. They were a lifeline to a starving city. They created openings that allowed supplies to reach desperate civilians, bolstered the defenders' morale, and applied pressure on the encircling German forces. The operations also symbolized the city's resilience and the beginning of a slow reversal in the siege, showing that even under extreme adversity, strategic initiative could alter the balance of survival. By combining relentless artillery barrages with precise airstrikes, the Soviets gradually forced the encircling forces into a reactive posture. Each successful delivery of food, fuel, or medical aid strengthened both the physical and psychological endurance of Leningrad's population. The campaign highlighted the interconnectedness of military strategy, logistics, and human endurance, and it marked the first clear signs that the siege's deadliest phase could be mitigated. The winter thaw, coupled with Soviet pressure, demonstrated that while the blockade remained formidable, the resilience of the defenders, civilians, and the Soviet military made it increasingly difficult for the German forces to maintain absolute control. Hope, tentative but growing, began to permeate the city. For Leningraders, every truck that crossed the ice, every ton of food delivered, and every evacuated child represented a small triumph against the relentless siege, a reminder that human courage and strategy could bend even the harshest circumstances toward survival. In conclusion, the combination of Soviet artillery and air operations in early 1943 marked a critical turning point in the siege of Leningrad. It provided essential supplies, facilitated evacuations, weakened German positions, and renewed morale among both soldiers and civilians. These efforts exemplified the strategic and human dimensions of endurance under siege, illustrating that even in a city encircled, battered, and starving, hope and resilience could persist, paving the way for the eventual partial relief and survival of Leningrad's population. By January 1943, nearly 500 days into the brutal siege of Leningrad, the city's residents faced the first tangible hope of survival beyond mere endurance. The Soviets had managed to open the road of life, a precarious supply and evacuation route across frozen Lake Ladoga, finally delivering critical food and fuel to civilians and evacuating the most vulnerable. This narrow corridor represented not just a logistical achievement but a psychological lifeline, offering relief after more than a year of relentless starvation, disease, and cold. The operation of the Road of Life was an immense challenge. Convoys of trucks, sleds, and small boats traversed the frozen lake under constant threat from German artillery and aerial bombardment. Drivers navigated treacherous ice, snow drifts, and shifting weather conditions, while volunteers assisted in unloading supplies and coordinating the evacuation of children, the elderly, and the sick. Every journey was a delicate balance between risk and necessity, as one misstep could plunge both people and supplies into the icy waters below. Food and fuel began to trickle into Leningrad, alleviating some of the city's extreme deprivation. Bread, flour, and other rations reached communal kitchens, hospitals, and households, providing residents with more than the bare minimum necessary to survive. Coal and wood supplies allowed for modest heating in homes and public shelters, reducing frostbite and hypothermia cases among both civilians and soldiers. Even limited relief had a profound impact. Families shared news of arriving convoys, and the collective morale of the city experienced a cautious uplift after months of despair. The opening of the corridor also enabled the evacuation of thousands of civilians, primarily children, the elderly, and those severely weakened by malnutrition or illness. Families who had been living on the edge of survival were transported to safer Soviet-held territory, removing some of the immediate humanitarian pressure from the city while saving lives that might otherwise have been lost. Each evacuation was both an act of hope and a reminder of the human cost of the siege. Many were forced to leave relatives behind, and countless lives had already been claimed by starvation and bombardment. Psychologically, the arrival of the first convoys brought a mix of relief, exhaustion, and grief. Residents felt hope rekindled as supplies reached their neighborhoods, yet the scars of nearly 500 days of deprivation were deeply felt. Families mourned those lost to hunger, disease, and cold, while simultaneously grappling with the enormity of survival itself. The cautious optimism was tempered by the realization that the siege was not yet over, and that continued vigilance and endurance would still be required. The Road of Life exemplified the interplay of courage, coordination, and human endurance. Drivers risked their lives repeatedly to maintain supply lines, volunteers organized distribution networks within the city, and military personnel ensured that the corridor remained operational under extreme conditions. The success of the operation required ingenuity and bravery at every level, demonstrating that survival in Leningrad depended not only on the efforts of the military but also on the dedication of ordinary citizens. Even as supplies reached Leningrad, the city continued to face challenges. German forces maintained artillery bombardments, and the winter conditions remained harsh. Ice on the lake was constantly shifting, storms could halt convoys for days, and every vehicle and cargo load was at risk. Despite these dangers, the opening of the corridor marked a decisive turning point, proving that the city could receive aid and that the siege's unyielding grip could be partially breached. For the civilians, this partial relief translated into tangible improvements in daily life. Bread lines moved more efficiently, hospitals received much-needed medicines, and families could finally supplement the meager rations they had been surviving on. Children, previously weakened by months of starvation, gained enough nourishment to endure the remaining winter. Workers in factories and municipal services were better able to sustain essential operations, indirectly supporting both the military defense and civilian welfare. The corridor also had symbolic significance. Its operation demonstrated that Leningrad was not isolated, and that the Red Army remained capable of action beyond the city's perimeter. This knowledge bolstered morale and reinforced the belief that endurance could be rewarded, providing the population with renewed psychological strength to face the final months of the blockade. In conclusion, the opening of the Road of Life in January 1943 marked the first significant relief for Leningrad in nearly 500 days. Supplies reached civilians, vulnerable populations were evacuated, and a lifeline was established in the midst of near-total deprivation. While the siege continued, and hardships remained severe, the operation provided cautious optimism, tangible survival support, and a profound psychological boost. It was a turning point in human endurance, illustrating the impact of coordinated courage, logistical ingenuity, and communal effort in the face of relentless adversity. The city, battered yet unbroken, experienced the beginnings of life beyond mere endurance, a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope and solidarity could prevail, and that the human spirit could endure and adapt against the most extreme conditions. By the winter of 1942-43, Leningrad's survival hinged on one of the most remarkable feats of wartime ingenuity and courage, the operation of the Road of Life across frozen Lake Ladoga. For nearly a year and a half, the city had endured a relentless siege, bombarded by German and Finnish artillery, cut off from most supply lines, and subjected to starvation and disease. The frozen lake became both a lifeline and a deadly obstacle, as trucks, sleds, and makeshift transports braved sub-zero temperatures, treacherous ice, and enemy attacks to deliver essential supplies and evacuate civilians. The operation's primary objective was dual: deliver desperately needed food, fuel, and medicine to the city while providing a means of evacuation for vulnerable populations, including children, the elderly, and the sick. The lake itself, frozen to varying thicknesses by the harsh Russian winter, was a dangerous highway. Convoy drivers and crews faced the constant risk of ice cracking under the weight of heavily laden vehicles, hidden crevices, and sudden blizzards that could disorient even the most experienced navigators. One misstep could plunge trucks and supplies, along with those inside, into the frigid waters below, making every journey a life-or-death gamble. The threat of enemy action compounded the peril. German artillery targeted the frozen crossings whenever reconnaissance identified movement, and Luftwaffe aircraft periodically strafed or bombed supply convoys. Despite this, the operation continued almost uninterrupted, as the necessity of sustaining the besieged population outweighed the risks. Drivers, engineers, and volunteers displayed extraordinary courage, navigating under constant fire while maintaining precise timing and coordination to maximize the number of trips across the lake. Civilians played an indispensable role in the Road of Life. Volunteers helped load and unload supplies, organized the distribution of rations within the city, and coordinated the evacuation of children and infirm residents. Many residents, themselves weakened by starvation and exposure, participated in labor-intensive tasks, demonstrating extraordinary ingenuity and endurance. Children and teenagers, though extremely vulnerable, assisted by carrying messages, gathering firewood, or supporting medical personnel, contributing to the broader effort to maintain the city's survival. Logistical challenges were immense. Trucks were often overloaded with sacks of flour, coal, and medicine, while sleds carried smaller loads or evacuated civilians. Engines had to be adapted to withstand sub-zero temperatures, and drivers improvised with chains on tires or weighted loads to prevent sliding or tipping. Coordinating arrivals and departures under such conditions required precise planning, as ice thickness varied across the lake, and storms could halt convoys for days. The psychological impact of the operation was profound. For the city's residents, the arrival of even small amounts of supplies represented a lifeline, a tangible reassurance that survival was possible. Every convoy that successfully crossed the ice brought bread to the hungry, coal to heat homes, and hope to hearts long accustomed to despair. Evacuations, though limited in scale, rescued thousands of the most vulnerable, underscoring that the city could endure the siege with strategic support and coordinated effort. The road of life exemplified human courage under extreme pressure. Drivers braved freezing winds, enemy fire, and treacherous ice, while volunteers and military personnel coordinated the delivery and distribution of supplies with ingenuity and precision. Each successful trip reinforced the city's determination to survive, illustrating that collective effort and unwavering resolve could defy seemingly insurmountable odds. Nature itself became both an ally and an enemy. The frozen surface of Lake Ladoga allowed vehicles to cross where boats could not, creating a lifeline that otherwise would have been impossible. Yet the same ice could shift, crack, or collapse, threatening lives and supplies in an instant. Snowstorms and whiteout conditions made navigation perilous, while the cold sapped the strength of drivers, crews, and volunteers. Endurance, alertness, and courage were essential for every crossing. By the end of the winter of 1942-43, the road of life had proven indispensable for Leningrad's survival. Supplies and evacuations allowed the city to maintain a fragile equilibrium, preventing mass starvation and providing a psychological boost that reinforced both civilian and military morale. Even under the constant threat of enemy action and the harshest winter conditions, the operation demonstrated that ingenuity, coordination, and bravery could sustain life against almost insurmountable odds. In conclusion, the road of life across Lake Ladoga became a symbol of Leningrad's endurance, courage, and communal effort. Civilians, soldiers, and volunteers worked in unison to keep the city alive, traversing dangerous ice under enemy fire and extreme cold. Supplies reached the city, vulnerable populations were evacuated, and the morale of the besieged was bolstered. The operation exemplified how human ingenuity and heroism can overcome both natural and military obstacles, ensuring that Leningrad would survive one of the longest and harshest sieges in history. The courage displayed in this operation, and the lives saved as a result, remain an enduring testament to the resilience of the human spirit under extreme conditions. By the winter of 1942-43, Leningrad had endured nearly a year and a half under relentless siege, and the city's population faced the stark reality of extreme starvation. Food rations had dwindled to life-threateningly low levels, sometimes amounting to as little as 125 grams of bread per person per day, barely enough to sustain the human body under normal conditions, let alone in sub-zero temperatures and while performing the arduous tasks of daily survival. The residents of Leningrad were forced to innovate, endure, and ration meticulously, as every crumb of sustenance became a precious lifeline in the struggle to survive. Bread, the staple of Leningraders' diet, was often stretched with fillers such as sawdust, cellulose, or other inedible materials, creating black bread that could be chewed but provided minimal nourishment. Citizens scavenged for whatever edible items they could find, frozen roots, scraps of vegetables, or even small animals when available. Meals were often small, infrequent, and calculated with strict precision to extend available supplies as long as possible. Families divided portions carefully, with parents frequently sacrificing their own meager rations to feed children or the elderly. Children and the elderly suffered disproportionately under these conditions. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, leaving them vulnerable to disease and frostbite. Children often appeared emaciated, their growth stunted, and their energy depleted. Elderly residents, already frail, succumbed rapidly to cold and starvation, sometimes dying quietly in their homes or while attempting to queue for meager rations. Despite this, many children displayed remarkable ingenuity and resilience, assisting with household tasks, caring for siblings, or contributing to communal efforts, even as their own survival hung in the balance. The impact of extreme rationing extended beyond mere physical deprivation. Hunger pervaded the psychological landscape of the city, creating constant anxiety, despair, and tension. Families worried not only for themselves but for neighbors and friends, and the inability to provide sufficient sustenance for loved ones weighed heavily on the population. Daily life was dominated by the search for food, the management of meager supplies, and the careful preservation of calories. Every day became a calculation of endurance, when to eat, how to share, and how to conserve energy for the next grueling day. Black markets and informal food networks emerged as desperate citizens sought alternatives to official rations. These often operated under clandestine conditions, offering slightly more nourishment at high personal risk. Those caught hoarding or trading outside official channels faced penalties, yet these underground networks were essential for supplementing the minimal supplies distributed through the city's rationing system. Community solidarity also played a crucial role, as neighbors shared portions, organized collective cooking, and supported one another through the most desperate times. Medical consequences of starvation were severe. Hospitals, already stretched thin by casualties from bombardments and disease, faced a surge of patients suffering from malnutrition-related illnesses, frostbite, and complications from weakened immunity. Doctors and nurses improvised treatments, often without adequate supplies or heating. Patients were sometimes forced to be treated in unheated rooms, with volunteers assisting in transporting water, food, and basic care items to sustain life as best as possible. Amid the relentless deprivation, the human spirit endured. Leningraders adapted to the daily agony, finding small ways to maintain morale and humanity. Children improvised toys, engaged in games in snow-covered streets, or helped distribute communal rations. Adults organized shifts to carry food, maintain heating stoves, or repair essential infrastructure. These small acts of resilience underscore the city's ability to persevere despite overwhelming adversity. The winter of starvation demonstrated that survival in Leningrad was not merely a physical struggle but a collective effort of civic coordination, ingenuity, and courage. Families, neighbors, and volunteers contributed to ensuring that every scrap of food, every ration, and every calorie was maximized. Communal kitchens, orphanages, and shelters became hubs of both sustenance and social support, helping to maintain cohesion and morale even as deaths from hunger mounted. By early 1943, the winter rations had become a grim metric of endurance. While the road of life across Lake Ladoga had begun delivering some supplies, the city still faced starvation-level food availability for most residents. The meager bread and black market supplements allowed survival, but malnutrition, weakness, and mortality remained high. Yet the population's determination, ingenuity, and solidarity kept the city alive, defying the encirclement and the German strategy of attrition. In conclusion, the winter of 1942-43 and the extreme rationing in Leningrad exemplified the agony and resilience of a city under siege. Starvation, disease, and harsh winter conditions tested civilians and soldiers to their limits. Children and the elderly suffered the most, yet the collective ingenuity of the population, the solidarity among neighbors, and the resourcefulness of volunteers allowed life to continue against almost insurmountable odds. The road of life and local improvisation provided critical lifelines, and every rationed slice of bread represented both survival and defiance. The winter of starvation thus stands as a somber reminder of human endurance in extreme adversity. It reflects both the relentless cruelty of war and the extraordinary capacity of people to persevere, adapt, and maintain hope even when survival depends on the smallest, most fragile resources. Leningraders endured, preserved life, and demonstrated that even amid grinding hunger and frost, courage and human solidarity could sustain a city under siege. By the winter of 1942-43, the siege of Leningrad had reached one of its most lethal phases, as extreme cold, starvation, and overcrowding combined to create an environment ripe for disease and death. Harsh winter conditions compounded the city's already dire circumstances, turning frostbite, typhus, and other illnesses into daily threats to survival. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and medical personnel, themselves exhausted and malnourished, worked tirelessly under impossible conditions to treat the sick and wounded. Civilian mortality surged, underscoring the relentless cruelty of both war and environment. The extreme cold intensified every aspect of daily life. Temperatures routinely plummeted far below freezing, leaving streets, pipes, and infrastructure frozen solid. Residents faced frostbite not only when venturing outdoors but also indoors, as fuel shortages limited heating to a fraction of homes and public shelters. Families resorted to burning furniture, books, and scraps of wood to maintain warmth. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and in severe cases, entire limbs, adding a layer of physical suffering to the already dire effects of malnutrition and psychological stress. Malnutrition left the population extremely vulnerable to disease. Typhus, dysentery, and respiratory infections spread rapidly in overcrowded apartments, shelters, and hospitals. With rationing at starvation levels, individuals lacked the strength to fight off infections, leading to a dramatic increase in mortality. Outbreaks of typhus were particularly deadly, transmitted by lice in the cramped living quarters. Hospitals, already under strain from bombardment injuries, were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of patients suffering from malnutrition-related illnesses and infectious diseases. Medical personnel worked under extraordinary conditions. Doctors and nurses performed surgeries, treated frostbite, and administered care with minimal supplies, often improvising with whatever resources were available. Candlelight and wood stoves provided the only illumination and warmth in makeshift clinics, while volunteers assisted with basic tasks like carrying patients, fetching water, or distributing medicine. Exhaustion and malnutrition affected the caregivers as well, yet they persevered, aware that every patient saved was a small victory against the siege. Civilian mortality was staggering. Families often lost multiple members to starvation, cold, or disease. Children and the elderly were particularly susceptible, with many succumbing to illnesses that might have been treatable under normal conditions. Makeshift cemeteries and mass graves became commonplace as municipal authorities struggled to manage the dead and frozen ground. Corpses often remained exposed for days before burial, adding to the psychological trauma for survivors. The combination of environmental extremes and epidemic created a relentless cycle of suffering. Cold weakened the immune system, starvation sapped strength, and overcrowding facilitated the spread of disease. Each factor reinforced the others, creating a devastating synergy that challenged both the physical and mental resilience of Leningrad's population. Yet, despite these overwhelming conditions, the city continued to function, with citizens and soldiers alike performing extraordinary acts of endurance and solidarity. Survival required ingenuity and adaptability. Families shared meager rations, neighbors assisted one another in gathering firewood, and volunteers maintained essential services, from delivering water to caring for the sick. Communal kitchens, orphanages, and shelters became hubs of survival, providing food, warmth, and social support. These coordinated efforts allowed the city to persist despite mounting casualties and relentless environmental pressures. Even amid widespread death, acts of heroism persisted. Civilians risked exposure to frost and enemy fire to deliver medicine or transport the sick. Medical personnel worked long hours without breaks, improvising treatments with limited supplies. Volunteers maintained supply routes across ice and snow, ensuring that food and fuel reached those most in need. These efforts highlighted the city's capacity for collective resilience and the human ability to endure under extreme adversity. By the end of this winter phase, the siege had transformed Leningrad into a city where survival itself became a daily triumph. Every loaf of bread, every medical intervention, every warm shelter represented a small victory against overwhelming odds. While mortality remained high, the combined efforts of civilians, soldiers, and medical staff ensured that the city could persist through the deadliest months of the blockade. In conclusion, the winter of 1942-43 in Leningrad exemplified the relentless struggle against both environment and epidemic. Frostbite, starvation, and disease claimed thousands of lives, overwhelming hospitals and exhausting caregivers. Yet the courage, ingenuity, and solidarity of civilians and military personnel enabled the city to endure. Leningrad's ability to survive the harshest conditions of the siege serves as a testament to human resilience, demonstrating that even in the face of extreme cold, starvation, and epidemic, determination and cooperation can preserve life and hope. Amid the unrelenting siege of Leningrad, where starvation, bombardment, and bitter winter threatened the very survival of the city, its cultural life persisted as a vital form of resistance. Even in the darkest days, the people of Leningrad found ways to preserve music, theater, literature, and art, using creativity to sustain morale, inspire courage, and document the realities of life under siege. The cultural sphere became both a refuge and a weapon against despair, proving that the human spirit can endure even under the most extreme conditions. Theaters, concert halls, and community centers, often partially destroyed or requisitioned for shelters, continued to host performances. Musicians played in makeshift auditoriums or basements, their instruments warmed over stoves to prevent freezing, filling the air with music that lifted hearts amidst death and deprivation. Famous symphonies were performed alongside improvised ensembles, sometimes for small groups of exhausted soldiers, children, and civilians who craved normalcy and emotional reprieve. Even as bread was scarce and heating limited, these performances reminded residents of the beauty of life and the strength of shared cultural identity. Writers and journalists documented daily life in the besieged city, producing poems, diaries, and articles that captured both the suffering and the heroism of Leningrad's population. These accounts provided citizens with a sense of shared experience and purpose, reinforcing the idea that the city's endurance would not go unnoticed or unrecorded. Personal letters and literary works often highlighted acts of bravery, selflessness, and ingenuity, fostering hope and resilience even in the face of death and deprivation. Artists, too, played a significant role in maintaining morale. Painters, illustrators, and sculptors depicted scenes of the city under siege, the frozen streets, ration lines, and the bravery of citizens. Their work, often displayed in public spaces or circulated among neighborhoods, served to validate the experiences of ordinary residents and provide a sense of community and shared struggle. Even rudimentary sketches made by children or amateur artists became a testament to the human capacity for creativity under duress. Propaganda efforts were closely intertwined with cultural activities, emphasizing themes of resistance, courage, and Soviet patriotism. Radio broadcasts, leaflets, and newspapers highlighted heroic deeds, the resilience of workers and soldiers, and the determination of citizens to endure. While intended to motivate and unify, these communications also helped people make sense of their suffering, framing the siege not only as a trial of survival but as a collective effort toward eventual victory. Cultural endeavors had tangible psychological effects. For citizens enduring months of hunger, frostbite, and bombardment, attending a musical performance or theater reading could provide a fleeting sense of normalcy, a brief escape from the daily horrors of the siege. It reinforced social cohesion, strengthened morale, and reminded people of the life they were fighting to preserve. Even small gatherings, like communal poetry readings or storytelling sessions, became acts of defiance, asserting that Leningrad's identity and humanity would not be extinguished by the blockade. The endurance of cultural life also served as a record for future generations. Diaries, music sheets, sketches, and reports created during the siege preserved the emotional and social reality of living under such extreme conditions. They documented not only the suffering but also the creativity, courage, and humanity that persisted amidst starvation and death. These cultural artifacts have since provided historians, scholars, and the general public with a vivid, humanized understanding of the siege beyond statistics and military reports. Children, despite their vulnerability, participated in cultural preservation. Schools organized performances, music lessons, and creative projects, often improvising with scarce materials. These activities provided children with psychological relief, helped maintain education, and instilled a sense of agency and contribution. Even amid hunger and cold, the act of creating or performing offered hope and a sense of purpose. By the winter of 1942-43, cultural resilience had become integral to the city's survival. It was not simply entertainment, it was a form of psychological sustenance, bolstering determination, fostering solidarity, and maintaining the human spirit under siege. Soldiers, civilians, children, and artists alike drew strength from the persistence of music, theater, and literature, demonstrating that even in extreme deprivation, creativity and shared culture could sustain morale and community cohesion. In conclusion, the cultural life of Leningrad during the siege, from theater performances and concerts to diaries, sketches, and propaganda, exemplified the resilience of the human spirit. Amid starvation, disease, and relentless enemy attacks, music, art, and literature became tools of hope, defiance, and psychological survival. They allowed residents to maintain identity, morale, and cohesion, proving that even in the darkest times, creativity and shared humanity can shine through despair, sustaining both individuals and the city as a whole. Leningrad's cultural endurance remains a powerful reminder that in war, survival is not only physical but also profoundly human and spiritual. During the siege of Leningrad, as starvation, frostbite, and relentless bombardment pressed the city to its limits, the most intimate chronicles of life came from the letters and diaries of civilians and soldiers. These personal accounts provide a deeply human perspective on endurance, suffering, and solidarity under conditions that defy ordinary comprehension. They not only recorded the physical hardships of hunger and exposure but also captured the psychological resilience and acts of generosity that sustained the besieged population. Soldiers and civilians alike wrote with the awareness that their words might never reach their intended recipients. Letters sent to family members elsewhere in the Soviet Union or even within the city were often delayed, intercepted, or lost entirely. Yet the act of writing was itself an assertion of humanity, a means of connecting, of preserving identity, and of recording experience. Soldiers detailed long marches, shortages of food, the constant cold, and their fears for the lives of friends and comrades. Civilians described daily struggles to secure bread, maintain warmth, and care for children and the elderly. One recurring theme in these writings was the generosity and self-sacrifice displayed in the face of extreme scarcity. Parents often rationed themselves to feed their children, Neighbors shared meager supplies to help those too weak to queue for bread, and volunteers braved the snow and enemy fire to deliver medicine and fuel. Letters often recounted such acts, highlighting that even amid deprivation, human compassion persisted. These narratives serve as powerful reminders that resilience was not just physical, but moral and communal. Diaries, kept by both civilians and soldiers, provided more detailed daily accounts. They chronicled frostbite injuries, illnesses from malnutrition, and the slow decay of living conditions. Yet alongside these grim realities were notes of ingenuity and adaptation, people using tree bark to extend bread, melting snow for water, and crafting makeshift stoves to combat the cold. Soldiers described improvised defenses, community watches, and ration-sharing efforts that allowed units to maintain operational capability despite starvation. The letters also reveal the psychological impact of prolonged siege. Fear, despair, and grief were common, yet these emotions were interwoven with hope and perseverance. Some letters expressed gratitude for even the smallest acts of kindness, others offered encouragement to loved ones, reminding them to remain strong despite adversity. Children's diaries, when preserved, often combined innocence with startling maturity, recounting the necessity of helping families, scavenging for food, or surviving frostbite, illustrating how the siege accelerated emotional growth under extreme circumstances. These personal accounts became essential to preserving historical memory. While official records documented military operations, rations, and casualties, letters and diaries provided a human dimension, capturing the lived experience of those who endured Leningrad's harsh winters, relentless bombardments, and the constant threat of starvation. Researchers and historians have since relied on these writings to understand not just the statistics of the siege but the emotional, moral, and social fabric of the city under extreme duress. Letters from the starving also illustrate the interplay between individual agency and collective survival. Even small gestures, sharing a piece of bread, helping a neighbor carry supplies, or comforting a sick child, became monumental acts of courage in an environment defined by deprivation. By recording these moments, residents not only documented survival strategies but also affirmed their humanity in a context designed to dehumanize them. The preservation of these letters was itself an act of resilience. Many were hidden in walls, buried under floors, or protected in attics, ensuring that the stories of suffering, endurance, and courage would survive the war. When discovered decades later, they provided a first-hand account of life at the edge of human endurance, bridging the gap between history and personal experience. In conclusion, the letters and diaries of Leningrad's residents during the siege offer a unique and poignant window into extreme hardship. They reveal not only the physical suffering caused by starvation, frostbite, and disease but also the extraordinary resilience, self-sacrifice, and communal solidarity that allowed the city to survive. Each letter, each diary entry, stands as a testament to the human spirit in the face of near-total deprivation, preserving the memory of courage, ingenuity, and compassion that defined Leningrad's endurance under siege. These personal accounts ensure that the story of survival is not merely a statistic but a profoundly human narrative of perseverance and hope. By spring 1942, the siege of Leningrad had entered a perilous new phase, as German and Finnish forces intensified their bombardments and tightened the encirclement around the city. After months of winter deprivation, the spring thaw did little to alleviate the suffering. Instead, it brought renewed strategic pressure, amplified hardship, and a constant reminder that survival was far from guaranteed. Civilians and defenders alike found themselves caught in a tightening vice, with scarcity, destruction, and fear intensifying daily life under siege. The German military sought to exploit the relative reprieve of winter's end, increasing artillery shelling and air raids to disrupt any semblance of recovery. Factories, hospitals, and residential neighborhoods became targets, further straining the city's already fragile infrastructure. Every bombardment caused casualties, destroyed food supplies, and damaged heating and water systems, exacerbating the harsh conditions that had carried over from winter. The city's population, already weakened by months of starvation and frostbite, faced mounting mortality and despair. Civilians struggled to adapt to the intensifying pressure. Food rationing, which had already reached minimal levels, was tightened further as supplies were consumed faster than they could be replenished. Black markets thrived in desperation, though scarcity limited even illegal access to food. Families and neighbors relied on one another more than ever, sharing what little they had to ensure that children, the elderly, and the sick could survive another day. Community solidarity became not only a moral imperative but a practical necessity for enduring the tightening siege. The military defenders of Leningrad, meanwhile, worked under extreme stress to reinforce the city's fortifications. Artillery and sniper positions were maintained around the perimeter, often in hastily repaired or improvised bunkers. Soldiers contended with insufficient ammunition, freezing temperatures, and exhaustion, yet remained vigilant to prevent German forces from exploiting any potential weakness in the encirclement. Coordination between frontline troops and civilians was essential, as both groups depended on each other for survival, intelligence, and logistical support. The tightening siege also had a psychological impact. The constant threat of death from bombardment, disease, and starvation weighed heavily on the city's population. Anxiety, grief, and despair were pervasive, yet resilience persisted. Letters and diaries from the period reveal a mix of fear and determination, as citizens documented their struggles while holding on to hope for eventual relief. Communities organized shelters, communal kitchens, and makeshift medical facilities, turning adversity into an opportunity to reinforce social bonds and collective endurance. Health crises escalated during this period. Malnutrition, already widespread, led to increased susceptibility to disease. Typhus, dysentery, and respiratory infections spread rapidly, with hospitals overwhelmed and supplies dwindling. Medical personnel, themselves weakened by cold and hunger, worked tirelessly in makeshift conditions to treat the afflicted, while volunteers assisted in transporting water, fuel, and food to those most in need. Every successful effort to sustain life became a small triumph against the relentless pressure of the encirclement. Despite these extreme challenges, the city demonstrated remarkable resourcefulness and resilience. Civilians improvised food substitutes, reused materials for warmth, and created networks for sharing essential goods. Soldiers adapted tactics to defend strategic points while minimizing exposure to bombardments. Volunteers risked their lives delivering supplies across exposed areas, maintaining lines of communication, and ensuring that evacuations across Lake Ladoga could continue whenever ice conditions allowed. Morale, though strained, was maintained through community solidarity, cultural resilience, and small acts of courage. Public readings, musical performances, and religious observances, though limited, provided moments of respite and reinforced a shared sense of identity. The psychological weight of knowing that each day survived was an achievement in itself helped citizens persevere. In summary, the spring of 1942 marked a critical intensification of the siege. German forces renewed their attacks, tightening the encirclement and increasing the mortality and suffering within Leningrad. Civilians, soldiers, and volunteers were tested to their limits, facing starvation, disease, and destruction while maintaining the city's defenses and daily operations. The period illustrated the suffocating pressure of prolonged warfare on a trapped population, highlighting both the extreme challenges of survival and the extraordinary endurance, ingenuity, and solidarity that allowed Leningrad to persevere in the face of overwhelming adversity. The siege during this period was a testament to the tenacity of human spirit under extreme duress. Every ration distributed, every barricade reinforced, and every convoy across Lake Ladoga represented a victory against the tightening grip of the enemy. Leningrad's experience in spring 1942 underscores the interplay between military strategy, civilian endurance, and human resilience, demonstrating that survival under siege is both a practical and profoundly psychological battle. During the siege of Leningrad, children endured some of the harshest consequences of starvation, disease, and exposure. As the blockade tightened and winter gripped the city, the youngest residents were particularly vulnerable to malnutrition, frostbite, and illness. Many lost parents or relatives to starvation, bombardment, or disease, leaving them orphaned and reliant on neighbors, volunteers, and communal shelters for survival. Yet despite these unimaginable hardships, countless children demonstrated remarkable resilience, ingenuity, and courage, finding ways to endure in a city under siege. Starvation hit children more severely than adults because their smaller bodies required proportionally fewer calories to survive, making the extreme rationing of food catastrophic for growth and immunity. Many relied on communal kitchens, improvised meals, and whatever scraps could be scavenged from streets or abandoned buildings. Some children consumed snow for hydration or boiled roots and bark when nothing else was available. Despite the scarcity, stories emerged of children sharing meager portions with siblings or friends, exemplifying early lessons in solidarity and compassion under extreme conditions. Disease compounded the suffering. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making children highly susceptible to typhus, dysentery, and respiratory infections. Overcrowded shelters and dormitories became breeding grounds for illness, and medical supplies were minimal. Hospitals and clinics, already overwhelmed, prioritized the most severe cases, leaving many children dependent on the care of neighbors, volunteers, or older children. Despite these challenges, creative solutions often arose: makeshift heating sources, improvised bedding, and communal efforts to maintain hygiene became essential survival strategies. Orphaned children faced particular peril. Many were taken in by neighbors, distant relatives, or community committees, which organized shelters and temporary homes. These safe havens provided minimal protection from hunger and cold but offered structure, supervision, and a sense of security amidst chaos. Older children frequently assumed adult responsibilities, caring for younger siblings or assisting in cooking, firewood collection, and ration distribution. Such responsibilities accelerated maturity but also forged a strong sense of resilience and ingenuity. Schools struggled to function, yet education continued whenever possible. Teachers adapted to the harsh conditions, providing lessons in literacy, numeracy, and practical survival skills. Schools doubled as shelters, kitchens, and communal centers, ensuring that even amid hunger and fear, children maintained a sense of routine, community, and hope. Extracurricular activities, simple games, storytelling, and singing helped sustain morale and provided psychological relief from the constant hardships. The siege also highlighted acts of extraordinary courage among children. Some navigated frozen streets alone to deliver messages or collect firewood. Others assisted neighbors by carrying supplies or helping care for the sick. Even small tasks became vital contributions to the city's survival, demonstrating that heroism under siege was not limited to adults or soldiers but extended to the youngest residents, whose actions often made the difference between life and death. Psychologically, these experiences left lasting impacts. Children internalized the stress, fear, and trauma of the siege, witnessing deaths and suffering on a daily basis. Yet at the same time, they absorbed lessons in cooperation, empathy, and resilience. Diaries, letters, and later recollections reveal a mixture of sorrow, fear, and pride at having endured one of history's most brutal blockades. The resilience of children during the siege became emblematic of Leningrad's broader survival. Their ability to adapt, cooperate, and contribute to community efforts illustrated that endurance in the city was not only about physical survival but also about psychological and social cohesion. Children's perseverance inspired adults, strengthened communal bonds, and reinforced a shared determination to resist the blockade. In summary, the children of Leningrad during the siege were among the city's most vulnerable yet remarkable survivors. Starvation, disease, and cold disproportionately affected them, while orphanhood and family loss heightened their challenges. Yet through ingenuity, mutual aid, and courage, they navigated the extreme hardships of life under siege. Schools, shelters, and community efforts provided vital support, sustaining hope and structure. Their experiences exemplify tragic resilience, highlighting how innocence can endure and adapt even in the most severe conditions, and offering a poignant reminder of human endurance under the duress of war. These young survivors of Leningrad stand as testaments to the human spirit, showing that even in the grip of starvation, ice, and death, courage and ingenuity can allow life to persist, and hope to endure in the darkest of times. By mid-1943, after nearly 2 years of unrelenting hardship, the citizens of Leningrad began to glimpse hope on the horizon. Soviet counteroffensives along the northern and southern flanks of the siege lines created weak points in the encirclement, allowing critical supplies and reinforcements to reach the city for the first time in months. Though the siege was far from over, these breakthroughs represented a tangible shift in the city's fortunes, offering a fragile promise of survival beyond mere endurance. The partial relief began with targeted offensives by Soviet forces along the approaches to Leningrad. Artillery bombardments and coordinated attacks forced German and Finnish units to redistribute their troops, leaving gaps in the blockade that could be exploited. These weak points allowed convoys to transport food, coal, and medicine into the beleaguered city, reducing immediate starvation risks and providing resources for heating and medical care. Each convoy that successfully crossed enemy lines brought not only sustenance but also a psychological boost to the exhausted population. For the civilians, the arrival of supplies was transformative. Ration lines, previously a scene of desperation and anxiety, now offered small but vital quantities of bread, vegetables, and fuel. Hospitals received medicine and essential equipment, helping to treat malnutrition-related illnesses and frostbite. Families cautiously celebrated these deliveries, balancing relief with the knowledge that shortages still persisted and winter conditions remained deadly. The sense of hope, however tentative, instilled renewed morale and resilience in both civilians and defenders. Reinforcements arriving with the convoys included soldiers, engineers, and medical personnel, bolstering the city's defenses and infrastructure. The integration of fresh troops and resources allowed the Red Army to fortify key positions, repair damaged supply lines, and support essential municipal functions. Civilians, invigorated by the arrival of help, participated actively in distributing food, maintaining heating, and assisting with logistics, reinforcing the collective effort that had sustained the city through its darkest months. The psychological effect of these partial breakthroughs cannot be overstated. After months of relentless deprivation, the sight of trucks carrying flour or coal, or the sound of artillery strikes pushing back the besiegers, inspired cautious optimism. Citizens began to envision a life beyond survival, imagining a future where hunger, cold, and bombardment might finally recede. Even small improvements, a slightly longer ration, repaired infrastructure, or a brief pause in enemy shelling, became symbols of resilience and the possibility of recovery. At the same time, the partial relief was a reminder of the fragility of survival. German forces remained nearby, artillery fire continued, and winter conditions still posed lethal threats. Civilians and soldiers alike understood that hope did not guarantee safety, and each supply convoy remained a precarious operation under threat from both the environment and enemy action. The cautious optimism balanced the grim reality, keeping the population vigilant while allowing morale to recover incrementally. Community efforts amplified the benefits of the incoming supplies. Volunteers helped unload trucks, transport rations to apartments and hospitals, and organize the distribution of food and fuel. Children and teenagers assisted where possible, learning to navigate the dangerous cityscape while contributing to the collective survival. These acts of solidarity reinforced the sense that the city could endure not through individual heroism alone but through coordinated communal effort. By spring 1943, the combination of Soviet counteroffensives, supply deliveries, and renewed morale marked a turning point in the siege. While the blockade was not fully lifted, the weak points created by the offensives allowed Leningrad to transition from mere endurance to active survival. The population could now strategize, distribute resources more effectively, and support both military and civilian operations with a degree of stability previously impossible. In conclusion, the Soviet counteroffensives that produced hope on the horizon represented a critical moment in Leningrad's siege. Supplies and reinforcements began reaching the city, providing both physical sustenance and a vital psychological boost. Civilians and soldiers cautiously embraced this light piercing through months of darkness, understanding that while challenges remained, survival was increasingly attainable. These developments highlighted the interplay of military action, logistics, and human resilience, demonstrating that even in a city subjected to extreme deprivation and constant threat, strategic pressure and collective effort could create the conditions for hope and eventual recovery. The cautious optimism of Leningrad's citizens during this period stands as a testament to the strength of human endurance. Even under the harshest siege conditions, the combination of strategic military advances and communal resilience offered a glimpse of survival and the first steps toward reclaiming life beyond the shadows of hunger, frost, and bombardment. By late 1943, as Leningrad approached the final months of its prolonged siege, the city remained in an extraordinary state of tension and deprivation. While German forces had failed to completely sever supply lines, the population continued to endure extreme hunger, cold, and bombardment. Yet signs of change began to emerge. Soviet reinforcements and partially restored supply corridors hinted that the siege's grip was loosening, even as survival remained perilous. These final months were a mixture of persistent hardship and cautious anticipation, testing the limits of human endurance. German forces, despite months of effort, were unable to maintain complete control over the approaches to the city. Partial Soviet counteroffensives and the opening of narrow supply corridors via Lake Ladoga allowed modest flows of food, coal, and medicine to reach civilians and military units. These supplies, though insufficient to fully alleviate suffering, provided critical sustenance and reinforced the defenders' capacity to hold the city. Every successful convoy represented both a lifeline and a psychological victory, signaling that Leningrad was not entirely isolated. Civilians continued to struggle against starvation and cold, often subsisting on minimal rations, black bread with fillers, and whatever edible materials could be found. Frostbite, malnutrition, and disease remained pervasive, particularly among children and the elderly. The city's medical services, though partially reinforced by incoming supplies and personnel, remained overwhelmed. Hospitals, field clinics, and volunteers worked tirelessly to treat those affected, improvising treatments and care under extremely harsh conditions. The psychological state of the population reflected the tenuous balance between despair and hope. Residents were acutely aware of the constant threat of death from hunger and exposure, yet the sight of Soviet troops advancing in convoys delivering supplies instilled a fragile optimism. Letters and diaries from the period reveal citizens' cautious acknowledgement that the siege might not last indefinitely, even as the daily struggle for survival continued. Soldiers defending the city also faced relentless challenges. Their posts, often in freezing, exposed positions, required constant vigilance. Supply shortages affected ammunition, heating, and basic necessities. Yet, they maintained defensive positions and coordinated with civilian efforts, understanding that any lapse could endanger the entire population. The combination of endurance, discipline, and emerging Soviet pressure helped stabilize the front lines, creating a foundation for the eventual relief of the city. Even amidst ongoing deprivation, acts of solidarity and courage persisted. Civilians organized communal kitchens, shared food and fuel, and assisted with medical care, while volunteers transported supplies across snow-covered streets and precarious ice routes. Children, though weakened, participated where possible, helping families and neighbors, ensuring that the city's survival remained a collective endeavor. These acts reinforced social cohesion and allowed the city to withstand both the material and psychological pressures of the final months of siege. The approach of Soviet reinforcements created a palpable sense of anticipation. While food and fuel were still scarce, residents recognized that the blockade's strict hold was eroding. German forces faced increasing pressure, unable to maintain the same level of control as in previous winters. Civilians and soldiers alike understood that the siege's end was not imminent but becoming increasingly plausible, creating a tense balance between endurance and hope. In these months, survival required extreme adaptability and perseverance. Families rationed every calorie, improvised heating, and coordinated communal efforts to sustain life. Soldiers and volunteers worked tirelessly to ensure that essential services continued despite ongoing bombardments and harsh conditions. Every successful distribution of food, every medical intervention, and every act of courage reinforced the population's capacity to survive. In conclusion, the final months of the siege of Leningrad were characterized by extreme hardship tempered by cautious anticipation. Civilians and defenders continued to endure starvation, frost, and bombardment, while limited supplies and the approach of Soviet reinforcements offered the first real hope of relief. The population's resilience, ingenuity, and solidarity allowed the city to persist even under the most severe conditions. This period underscores the interplay of human endurance, strategic military pressure, and logistical ingenuity, demonstrating that survival in extreme adversity is as much about psychological resilience and community cohesion as it is about physical sustenance. The end of the siege, while not yet realized, was beginning to cast its shadow, signaling that even in the darkest conditions, hope and perseverance could prevail. By January 1944, after more than 2 years of relentless siege, Leningrad finally experienced a pivotal breakthrough. Soviet offensives successfully lifted the encirclement, allowing the city to breathe for the first time in nearly 900 days. The lifting of the blockade marked a monumental achievement, not only in military terms but also in human resilience. Civilians and soldiers alike faced a profound mixture of relief, grief, and exhaustion, as the cost of survival became painfully clear in the faces of those who had endured starvation, frostbite, disease, and bombardment. The Soviet military offensive was meticulously coordinated. Units along the northern and southern sectors of the siege lines launched simultaneous attacks, targeting German and Finnish positions that had previously maintained near-complete control over the city. Artillery barges softened enemy fortifications, while infantry units pressed forward to reclaim strategic points and secure supply routes. These operations required precise timing, courage, and coordination, as enemy forces still retained pockets of resistance and could inflict substantial casualties. As the encirclement weakened, the city's lifelines across Lake Ladoga became more secure and efficient. Convoys of trucks, sleds, and boats transported supplies with greater reliability, reducing the constant threat of starvation. Fuel, food, and medical supplies flowed more steadily into the city, allowing hospitals to function more effectively and civilians to regain a measure of stability. The arrival of fresh rations and essential goods marked a dramatic shift in daily life, transforming survival from sheer endurance into a cautious hope for recovery. The civilian population, long subjected to extreme deprivation, reacted with a complex mix of jubilation and mourning. Streets and public spaces, once defined by hunger lines and despair, were now filled with cautious celebration. Yet the relief was tempered by grief for the tens of thousands who had perished during the blockade. Families mourned lost loved ones, neighbors reflected on the deaths of friends, and communities recognized that survival had come at an unimaginable human cost. The city itself bore visible scars, abandoned buildings, frozen corpses hastily buried, and remnants of makeshift shelters throughout neighborhoods. Soldiers defending Leningrad also experienced profound relief. Their prolonged efforts to hold strategic positions, man fortifications, and assist civilians had finally yielded results. Morale surged, but the emotional weight of comrades lost, the exhaustion of extended combat, and the enduring effects of frostbite and malnutrition reminded them that victory was measured in survival as much as in territorial gains. Veterans would carry the psychological imprint of the siege for decades, reflecting on both the resilience they had displayed and the immense suffering endured. The lifting of the siege also restored a sense of agency to the city's residents. For months, civilians had operated in a near-total state of dependency and fear, reacting to the blockade's pressures rather than shaping their environment. With Soviet forces reopening secure supply lines and reclaiming surrounding territory, citizens could participate more effectively in reconstruction, distribution of supplies, and care for the wounded and vulnerable. Communal kitchens, factories, and medical facilities could now function with greater efficiency, allowing the city to transition from survival to recovery. Despite the relief, challenges remained. Leningrad was still recovering from the long-term effects of malnutrition, frostbite, and disease, which had left countless residents physically weakened. Infrastructure was damaged or destroyed, requiring urgent repair to restore utilities, transportation, and public services. Psychological recovery would take years, as the trauma of extended siege conditions, mass deaths, and constant threat had deeply affected every segment of the population. The human endurance displayed during the siege was extraordinary. Families had rationed bread to nearly inhumanly low levels, children had adapted to extreme conditions, and volunteers had risked their lives transporting supplies and assisting the sick. Hospitals and medical personnel had functioned under near impossible conditions, and soldiers had defended the city with unwavering resolve. Every act of courage, ingenuity, and solidarity contributed to the eventual survival of the city and its population. In retrospect, the breaking of Leningrad's siege stands as a testament to resilience under extreme adversity. It illustrates how strategic military action, logistical coordination, and collective human effort can converge to overcome conditions that might otherwise seem insurmountable. The lifting of the encirclement in January 1944 transformed the city from a symbol of suffering into a symbol of endurance, courage, and communal perseverance. In conclusion, Leningrad's survival after nearly 900 days of siege represents both a triumph and a tragedy. The city endured constant starvation, freezing winters, disease, and relentless bombardment. The partial and eventual lifting of the blockade by Soviet forces brought relief, supplies, and renewed morale, yet the scars of human suffering remained evident in every street, home, and survivor. The story of Leningrad is a powerful testament to human resilience, collective courage, and the indomitable will to survive under the most extreme conditions of war. The city emerged alive, a living monument to endurance and the capacity of ordinary people to withstand extraordinary adversity. With the lifting of the siege of Leningrad in January 1944, the survivors faced the monumental task of rebuilding life amidst devastation. Civilians and soldiers emerged from nearly 900 days of starvation, cold, disease, and constant bombardment, carrying the profound physical and psychological scars of the ordeal. Recovery was a slow and painful process, requiring both practical reconstruction of the city's infrastructure and the gradual healing of communities traumatized by prolonged suffering and loss. The physical challenges were immense. Much of Leningrad's housing stock had been destroyed or severely damaged, leaving thousands without shelter. Factories and workshops, crucial for both wartime production and post-siege rebuilding, had suffered from neglect, bombardment, and shortages of materials. Roads, bridges, and utility lines required urgent repair to restore basic functionality and allow food, fuel, and medical supplies to circulate efficiently. Citizens worked tirelessly to rebuild their homes using salvaged materials, often improvising to create makeshift dwellings that would provide minimal protection against the harsh climate. Factories were gradually restored, allowing the city to resume limited industrial production. Civilians, including women and teenagers who had carried much of the labor burden during the siege, returned to their posts. Skilled workers repaired machinery, while others assisted with cleaning and clearing debris. These efforts were essential not only for economic recovery but also for psychological resilience, giving residents a sense of purpose and agency in a city that had endured unprecedented destruction. Medical recovery was equally critical. Hospitals and clinics, which had been overwhelmed during the siege, continued to treat lingering illnesses caused by malnutrition, frostbite, and infectious disease. Survivors faced chronic health issues, including weakened immune systems, lingering infections, and psychological trauma. Medical staff, often fatigued themselves from years of service, worked to restore health and provide support for both physical and mental rehabilitation. Psychological scars ran deep. Survivors mourned the tens of thousands who had perished, many of whom were family members, friends, or neighbors. Grief, guilt, and trauma persisted, manifesting in nightmares, anxiety, and depression. Communities organized memorials and commemorative events to honor the dead, preserving collective memory and helping the living process their loss. Schools and cultural institutions gradually reopened, offering children and adults alike a sense of continuity and stability amidst the ongoing recovery. Social structures had to be rebuilt as well. Families torn apart by death or evacuation reunited when possible, while neighbors supported one another in the restoration of daily routines. Communal kitchens, once essential for survival, shifted focus to more normalized food distribution, gradually replacing the harsh rationing of siege days with slightly more abundant and nutritious supplies. The gradual re-establishment of daily life, routines, and social bonds was critical for psychological healing and community cohesion. Despite progress, recovery was tempered by lingering hardship. Many residents remained physically weakened by prolonged malnutrition, and housing shortages persisted. Essential services like water, electricity, and heating required careful coordination to restore functionality. Survivors understood that rebuilding would take months, even years, and that full recovery was not immediate. Nonetheless, the ability to begin reconstruction, to reoccupy homes, reopen factories, and re-establish public services, signaled the first steps toward normalcy after the relentless siege. Civilians and soldiers also drew strength from shared experiences and collective endurance. Bonds forged during starvation, freezing conditions, and bombardments created strong communal networks that supported recovery. Volunteers continued to assist with rebuilding, distributing supplies, and caring for the sick and elderly. This communal effort reflected the spirit of resilience that had enabled the city to survive and would now sustain it during reconstruction. Education and cultural life gradually resumed, serving as both a symbol and instrument of recovery. Schools reopened where possible, providing children with structure and a sense of continuity. Artists, musicians, and writers returned to documenting life in post-siege Leningrad, both memorializing the ordeal and fostering hope for the future. Cultural activities helped survivors process trauma and restore a sense of identity and community pride, essential for psychological recovery. In conclusion, the survivors' return after the siege marked a critical phase of Leningrad's recovery. Civilians and soldiers began rebuilding homes, factories, and infrastructure, while simultaneously tending to the lingering physical and psychological scars of prolonged starvation, disease, and warfare. Communities mourned the dead, re-established social cohesion, and slowly restored cultural and educational institutions. This period reflected both the fragility and resilience of human endurance, as residents balanced hope with grief and worked tirelessly to reconstruct lives in a city scarred by one of history's longest and most brutal sieges. The survivors' efforts stand as a testament to human courage, perseverance, and collective determination, demonstrating that even after unimaginable hardship, the city's inhabitants could rebuild, recover, and reclaim a measure of normalcy amidst the ruins of war. Leningrad's slow return to life embodies both the physical and emotional resilience of a population determined to endure beyond the darkest days of siege. Even after the siege of Leningrad was lifted in January 1944, the city remained haunted by the scars of nearly 900 days of starvation, bombardment, and death. Streets, buildings, and public spaces bore the unmistakable marks of prolonged deprivation. Collapsed rooftops, shattered windows, and crumbling infrastructure reminded residents daily of the siege's relentless pressure. The city's physical wounds were mirrored by the emotional and psychological trauma of its survivors, who carried memories of loss, suffering, and unimaginable hardship. Every street and alley told a story of endurance and tragedy. Apartment buildings where families had perished, stairwells piled with the dead, and abandoned shops illustrated the human cost of the blockade. As survivors returned to rebuild homes and neighborhoods, the sight of frostbitten corpses or remnants of makeshift shelters reminded them of both those who survived and those who had succumbed to hunger and disease. Public spaces, once vibrant with daily life, were often silent, bearing the weight of collective grief. The memory of the siege was preserved not only in the city's architecture but also in personal accounts and communal storytelling. Survivors documented their experiences in diaries, letters, and memoirs, ensuring that the human dimension of the blockade, the endurance, ingenuity, and suffering, was recorded for posterity. Monuments, plaques, and cemeteries were erected to honor those who perished, creating tangible markers of the city's ordeal. These acts of remembrance allowed the community to acknowledge loss while fostering a sense of continuity and identity. Psychologically, the residents of Leningrad wrestled with the long-term impact of trauma. Survivors' guilt was widespread, as individuals who had endured the siege grappled with the deaths of family members, neighbors, and friends. Adults reflected on the impossible choices made during starvation, the rationing of food, and the inability to save everyone. Children, many of whom had lost parents or siblings, bore lasting scars in both body and mind. The collective memory of hunger, frostbite, and disease became a shared burden that shaped social and cultural life for decades. Despite the haunting memories, survivors sought to restore life in community. Families returned to homes when possible, shops reopened, and schools gradually resumed classes. Yet even as Leningrad rebuilt physically, the emotional and psychological wounds required care, reflection, and ongoing support. Public commemorations, community gatherings, and cultural projects helped residents process grief while reinforcing the shared resilience and endurance that had allowed the city to survive. Cemeteries became focal points for remembrance, where families and neighbors mourned the tens of thousands lost. Memorial services and annual observances honored both the civilian and military dead, ensuring that the experiences of those who perished were not forgotten. Monuments erected in public squares served as constant reminders of the siege, providing both education and reflection for younger generations. These commemorative practices were essential for transmitting collective memory and fostering a sense of continuity despite the staggering losses endured. The lingering presence of trauma influenced daily life in post-siege Leningrad. Citizens navigated spaces marked by death and destruction, often encountering reminders of famine and bombardment. Streets once teeming with activity now contain ruins, empty lots, or improvised memorials. Even as children played and commerce resumed, the psychological echoes of the blockade were present, a quiet testament to the enduring impact of prolonged suffering. In conclusion, the streets and buildings of Leningrad after the siege were haunted by the past, both physically and emotionally. The marks of starvation, cold, disease, and destruction remain visible, while the memories of loss, trauma, and endurance continued to shape the city's identity. Survivors carried the weight of grief and survivors' guilt, even as they rebuilt homes, communities, and institutions. Through commemorations, memorials, and personal narratives, the city preserved the human memory of the siege, ensuring that future generations understood the immense sacrifices and resilience that allowed Leningrad to survive. The haunted streets of Leningrad stand as a powerful reminder that while life can return after devastation, the scars, both tangible and intangible, endure, reflecting the profound costs of war and the extraordinary strength required to survive it. In the aftermath of Leningrad's 900-day siege, the city sought to honor the extraordinary endurance and sacrifice of its residents through a variety of monuments, museums, and memorials. These commemorative efforts serve not only to preserve the memory of those who suffered and died but also to educate future generations about the human cost of war and the resilience required to survive under extreme conditions. The city's landscape, still scarred by destruction, became a living repository of both grief and pride, embedding remembrance into everyday life. Monuments were erected throughout Leningrad to honor the fallen soldiers and civilians. Bronze statues, plaques, and symbolic sculptures dotted public squares, parks, and along major thoroughfares, each telling a story of courage, endurance, and communal struggle. These physical markers provided tangible recognition of the sacrifices made by ordinary citizens and military personnel alike. Central memorials commemorated both the defense of the city and the suffering of civilians who endured starvation, frostbite, and bombardment, ensuring that their experiences were not forgotten. Museums dedicated to the siege played a critical role in documenting and interpreting history. Exhibits included photographs of ruined streets, ration cards, personal diaries, and clothing preserved from the winter of deprivation. Letters from children, soldiers' journals, and testimonies from survivors provided intimate glimpses into daily life under blockade. These museums became sites of education, offering visitors a deeper understanding of the siege's human dimension beyond military statistics. They also served as a bridge between generations, connecting the memory of those who experienced the siege firsthand with those born long after its end. Families of survivors and victims frequently visited memorials and museums, participating in rituals of remembrance that reinforced the collective memory of Leningrad. Annual ceremonies, wreath-laying events, and moments of silence provided opportunities to reflect on both personal and communal loss. Veterans who had endured the siege often shared their stories with younger generations, ensuring that the lessons of endurance, solidarity, and human resilience were transmitted alongside historical facts. These rituals helped maintain the emotional connection to the siege, honoring the courage of those who lived through unimaginable hardship. Historians and scholars also contributed to remembrance by documenting the siege through research, publications, and oral histories. Their work preserved the complex narrative of survival, highlighting not only military strategy and political context but also the everyday lives of civilians. Through books, articles, and documentaries, they captured the interplay between starvation, disease, cold, and human ingenuity, ensuring that the historical record reflected the full scope of suffering and heroism. The collective commemoration of Leningrad's siege reinforced shared identity and civic pride. Residents recognized that the city had not only survived physically but also morally and psychologically. Memorials and museums created spaces where individuals could connect with the city's history, reflect on their own family's experiences, and honor neighbors, friends, and relatives who had endured unimaginable hardships. These acts of remembrance provided psychological continuity, helping communities reconcile with the past while moving forward. Educational initiatives further extended the impact of remembrance. Schools incorporated lessons about the siege into curricula, including field trips to museums and memorials. Students learned about rationing, survival strategies, and the human cost of prolonged conflict, fostering an early appreciation for resilience, solidarity, and civic responsibility. Oral history projects allowed children to interact with survivors, humanizing historical events and embedding the moral lessons of courage and endurance into the next generation's consciousness. Art and literature also played a key role in memory and remembrance. Poets, writers, and artists who had survived the siege or documented it soon after contributed works that conveyed the emotional intensity and lived experience of the blockade. Paintings depicting frozen streets, starving children, and exhausted soldiers provided visual testimony to complement historical records, while novels and memoirs captured the psychological and social dimensions of survival. These creative works became part of the city's cultural memory, reinforcing the lessons of endurance and human resilience for decades. In conclusion, the monuments, museums, and memorials established after the siege of Leningrad served as central pillars of memory and remembrance. They preserved the stories of civilians and soldiers, offered tangible evidence of survival and loss, and ensured that the human dimension of the blockade remained at the forefront of historical understanding. Families, veterans, historians, and educators all participated in these efforts, reinforcing the collective memory and honoring the courage, ingenuity, and perseverance that allowed the city to endure. The culture of remembrance in Leningrad demonstrates that memory is not passive. Through rituals, education, and public commemoration, the city transformed the horrors of siege into lessons in resilience, solidarity, and human dignity. The siege of Leningrad thus continues to resonate, reminding future generations that the endurance of the human spirit can prevail even under the most extreme conditions. The siege of Leningrad, lasting nearly 900 days from September 1941 to January 1944, has been the subject of extensive historical analysis, recognized not only as a catastrophic humanitarian crisis but also as a critical turning point on the Eastern Front of World War II. Historians have studied the siege from multiple perspectives: military strategy, urban defense, civilian resilience, and the psychological endurance of a population under extreme duress. Its significance extends beyond the immediate tactical outcomes, offering enduring lessons in human survival and the complexities of prolonged urban warfare. From a military standpoint, the siege demonstrated the strategic importance of Leningrad as both an industrial hub and a symbolic center of Soviet resistance. The city's survival prevented German forces from fully securing the northern sector of the Eastern Front, forcing the Wehrmacht to allocate substantial resources and manpower to maintain the blockade. Despite repeated offensives and artillery bombardments, Soviet defenders successfully protected key infrastructures, including factories, transportation networks, and communication lines, allowing them to sustain the broader war effort against the Nazi invasion. Military historians note that Leningrad's endurance tied down hundreds of thousands of German troops who could have been deployed elsewhere, affecting the overall dynamics of the Eastern Front. The siege also highlighted the challenges and innovations of urban defense. Civilians and military personnel worked together to fortify the city, build barricades, establish anti-aircraft positions, and maintain essential services under fire. The integration of citizen labor with military strategy showcased the potential for civil-military cooperation and prolonged urban conflict. Leningrad became a case study in how urban populations can contribute directly to defensive operations, illustrating lessons that have informed modern military doctrines regarding civilian involvement, logistics, and sustainment in besieged cities. Endurance and resilience emerged as central themes in historical analyses. The siege's extreme conditions, starvation, frostbite, disease, and bombardment, tested the limits of human survival. Historians emphasize that Leningraders' ability to maintain communal life, work in factories, and care for the sick and young under such conditions exemplifies extraordinary human fortitude. Diaries, letters, and oral testimonies provide rich qualitative data on coping mechanisms, social cohesion, and improvisation, offering insights into the psychological and sociological aspects of prolonged siege conditions. The humanitarian dimension of Leningrad's siege is equally important to historians. The city became a symbol of suffering on an unprecedented scale, with civilians enduring near-starvation rations, outbreaks of disease, and extreme cold. Mortality estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of people perished during the blockade, underscoring the devastating human cost of modern total warfare. Scholars analyze the siege to understand the intersection of military objectives and civilian survival, considering how strategic encirclement can function as both a tactical measure and a mechanism of terror against populations. The operation of the Road of Life across Lake Ladoga exemplifies the ingenuity and courage that enabled survival. Historians study these logistics operations as innovative solutions to maintain supply lines under extreme conditions. Convoys traversed ice and snow, transporting food, fuel, and medicine while facing artillery and aerial attacks. The success of these efforts demonstrates the critical role of logistics, coordination, and risk management in sustaining urban populations during wartime. Leningrad's siege also informs analyses of morale and cultural resilience. The continuation of theaters, music performances, schools, and communal rituals amidst starvation and bombardment reflects the city's determination to maintain identity and social cohesion. Historians view these cultural acts as essential to sustaining morale, emphasizing that psychological resilience is as crucial as physical survival in protracted crises. Strategically, the siege contributed to the broader Soviet counteroffensives that eventually turned the tide on the Eastern Front. By tying down German forces and absorbing significant enemy resources, Leningrad played a pivotal role in the gradual shift of momentum toward the Red Army, culminating in the eventual relief of the city and the wider Soviet advance. Military scholars highlight the siege as an example of strategic attrition, where human endurance and urban fortitude can influence operational and strategic outcomes far beyond the immediate battlefield. In summary, the Siege of Leningrad holds lasting historical significance as both a human and military phenomenon. It demonstrates the extreme costs of modern warfare, the capacities of urban populations to endure under siege, and the tactical and strategic implications of sustained encirclement. Historians continue to study Leningrad as a symbol of resilience, human suffering, and military ingenuity, offering lessons in endurance, civilian-military cooperation, and the consequences of protracted conflict. Leningrad's experience has become a benchmark for understanding urban sieges, humanitarian crisis management, and the limits of human endurance. It is remembered not only as a story of starvation and death but also as a testament to collective courage, perseverance, and the will to survive under the most extreme conditions. The siege's historical significance continues to inform military studies, psychological research, and socio-cultural analyses, ensuring that the lessons of Leningrad resonate far beyond its frozen streets. The Siege of Leningrad, lasting nearly 900 days from September 1941 to January 1944, has left an enduring legacy as a testament to human courage, resilience, and the indomitable spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. The city, encircled by German and Finnish forces, survived relentless bombardment, starvation, disease, and freezing winters. Its survival is remembered not only for the strategic implications on the Eastern Front of World War II but also for the extraordinary human endurance demonstrated by both civilians and soldiers. Leningrad's legacy serves as a profound reminder of the costs of war and the capacity of communities to endure and adapt under extreme conditions. Throughout the siege, civilians and soldiers displayed extraordinary resilience. Families rationed meager food supplies, shared warmth, and improvised shelters to survive the harsh winters. Children, the elderly, and the sick faced disproportionate suffering, yet communities organized themselves to provide care, maintain essential services, and sustain morale. Medical personnel, often exhausted and underfed themselves, worked tirelessly to treat frostbite, starvation-related illness, and disease. Every loaf of bread distributed, every fire lit to warm a home, and every patrol on the frozen streets represented a small victory against overwhelming adversity. Leningrad's defenders, both military personnel and volunteers, exhibited equal determination. Soldiers fortified positions, repelled attacks, and coordinated with civilians to ensure the city could withstand the German and Finnish blockade. Their efforts, combined with the ingenuity and bravery of residents, allowed the city to maintain functioning factories, hospitals, and infrastructure, despite the blockade's aim to starve and destroy. The city's survival demonstrated how collective endurance can shape strategic outcomes. German forces were forced to commit significant manpower and resources to maintain the siege, which indirectly benefited the broader Soviet war effort elsewhere on the Eastern Front. Cultural resilience played a crucial role in preserving the city's psychological fabric. Theaters, concerts, and art continued amidst rationing and ruin, providing both distraction and inspiration. Writers, musicians, and artists documented the horrors of the blockade, ensuring that experiences of suffering, ingenuity, and courage were preserved. These cultural acts fostered communal solidarity and maintained a sense of identity, highlighting that survival was not merely physical but also psychological and moral. The siege's logistics, especially the operation of the Road of Life across Lake Ladoga, exemplified the intersection of strategy and human ingenuity. Convoys of trucks, sleds, and boats transported essential supplies under extreme cold and enemy fire, saving thousands of civilians and soldiers. This lifeline not only provided sustenance but also symbolized hope, demonstrating that even under the most dire conditions, calculated coordination and bravery could preserve life. The human cost of the siege was staggering. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of Leningraders perished from starvation, disease, and exposure. Yet the population's perseverance ensured that the city survived, and the lessons learned about endurance, solidarity, and adaptation have resonated for generations. Diaries, letters, and oral histories preserved intimate accounts of hardship, heroism, and ingenuity, allowing future generations to understand the scale of suffering and the resilience it fostered. Leningrad's legacy extends beyond its historical moment. It serves as a symbol of survival against impossible odds, reminding future generations of the cost of war, the perils of totalitarian aggression, and the strength of human will. Military historians study the siege as an example of urban defense, attritional warfare, and civilian-military cooperation. Psychologists and sociologists analyze how communities endure prolonged trauma, and educators use Leningrad as a cautionary tale and source of inspiration. The city's endurance is commemorated through monuments, memorials, museums, and annual observances, which honor both civilian and military contributions. Families of survivors, historians, and educators continue to preserve stories and personal accounts, reinforcing the collective memory of courage, suffering, and solidarity. These rituals ensure that Leningrad's experience is not forgotten, providing lessons in perseverance, sacrifice, and the capacity of human communities to endure extreme adversity. In conclusion, Leningrad's 900-day siege stands as a powerful reminder of human resilience, courage, and solidarity under conditions that might otherwise have destroyed the city and its inhabitants. Its legacy embodies the profound endurance of ordinary people confronted with extraordinary hardship, demonstrating that survival is both a collective and deeply human achievement. The city remains a symbol of perseverance, teaching future generations the value of determination, community, and hope even in the darkest hours. The endurance of Leningrad is immortalized in history, memory, and culture, ensuring that the story of survival, ingenuity, and resilience continues to inspire and educate. The Siege of Leningrad is not only a historical event but a timeless testament to the human spirit, showing that courage and solidarity can prevail even when circumstances seem insurmountable.